Chapter 860. It's useless. The top is made of metal. The thickness of the rock is beyond your imagination. You can't break it. Amelia was relieved as she saw that Dudien's attack was ineffective. She said in a casual tone. Dean frowned. Amelia wasn't wrong. It would be difficult to break the metal wall with his current strength unless he attacked the same place day after day. But it would take too long and he wouldn't be able to hold on. Even if he used the ice claws that were embedded in the golden meatballs, he wouldn't be able to create any effect. After all, the thickness of the metal was almost completely ineffective. The hardness of the metal was beyond his knowledge of most of the metals. Even chromium, which was known as the strongest metal, might not have such hardness. Moreover, chromium was silver-white, but the metal in front of him was golden. The inner layer was dark red. He didn't know the characteristics of such a metal, but he thought that it might be an alien spaceship so he could understand it. It was most likely a metal from an alien planet. I don't think it's for load-bearing, right? Dean let go of the sword and jumped down from the rock wall. He landed in front of Amelia. His beast-like figure exuded a ferocious aura. He calmly looked down at Amelia. There was a trace of fear in her eyes. You have lived here for generations. How do you deal with the excrement? Excrement? Amelia was startled. She didn't expect Dudien to say such a dirty thing. It was even more embarrassing for a man to say it to a woman. But she thought that her body was exposed to Dudien's eyes. She didn't want to hide it anymore. She said in a sarcastic tone, "Have you been hungry for too long? How can you be interested in this thing? Outside your tribe, when I first came here, I didn't smell any stink of excrement along the way. Logically speaking, with the number of people living here, the amount of excrement produced every day should be astonishing. Accumulating every day, accumulating year after year, it should have piled up into a mountain and the stench should have spread for miles. But in fact, it didn't. There was a trace of interest in Dean's eyes. Can you tell me where these things went? Amelie was surprised. She understood why Dean would mention such a dirty thing. Although it was dirty, but it was a vital issue. It could lead to the secret of their tribe. Her heart sank again. Dean couldn't break the metal wall and basically had reached a dead end. But she felt that he had other means. I don't know. I'm a goddess, so I'm not interested in these things. If you are interested, then you can ask the villagers to contribute something to you. Amelie looked at Dudien. Dean stared at her eyes for a moment. He turned around and came to the front of the origami. He lifted his sharp limbs and continued to cut the rock wall next to the origami's remains. Amelia frowned as she looked at Dudien's back. There was an ominous premonition in her heart. Do you know how the hunters tracked down the monsters? Dean didn't look back as he talked to Amelie. The feces and footprints left by the monsters are the most valuable clues for the hunters to track them. That's why you haven't dumped the feces out for generations. I didn't smell any human feces when I was outside. I don't think the space here can hold the feces. So you should have a special way to deal with the feces or a special channel to transfer the feces far away so that the monsters don't smell the feces. Amelie's heart was getting colder as she listened to Dean's words. She felt that her limbs were getting cold. If there is such a channel, then that's where we can escape, Dean said. In addition to the feces channel, there should be an air purification channel and other channels. He didn't regard this primitive village as a primitive tribe after seeing the laser cannons. After all, the place where the great priest lived was full of high-tech equipment. Amelie bit her lips. Even if there is such a channel, do you want to climb out from a channel full of feces? Why not if I can survive? Dean said. But don't worry. I'm not looking for this channel. Amelie clenched her fingers. She felt a burst of suffocation and powerlessness. She thought that she would force Dean into a desperate situation again. She didn't expect that Dean would find a new way out and hope. It seemed that he would never face any difficulties. After a moment, Dean chiseled to the deepest part of the rock wall next to the origami. With a ding sound, a metal rock wall was exposed. He chiseled away all the rocks around the metal rock wall. He found that the metal rock wall was oval in shape. It was connected to the top of the golden wall. It was obviously unrealistic to dig a tunnel from the depths of the channel to leave the village. Dean was not surprised. He just frowned and continued to dig the earth. This time he changed the direction of digging deeper into the ground. He continued to dig along the metal rock wall. After digging out 30 to 40 meters of soil, he chiseled out a metal plate. It was very smooth. So that's how it is. Dean looked at the metal plate in the depths of the ground and finally understood. There was a trace of shock in his eyes. He had a lot of speculations in his mind from the various signs of the village. It should be known that in the abyss, there would be countless monsters who could survive for hundreds of years. The protection from the outside was far from enough. After all, there were many monsters who could drill into the ground and even inhabit the rock. If there was no corresponding protection, these monsters would become the #1 enemy that would destroy the village. This metal plate buried in the ground responded to his speculation. The entire village was contained in a metal ball. Or the entire village was in the alien spaceship that he had previously guessed. The reason why he thought so was that in addition to what he saw in front of him, there was also the fact that the Great Priest had asked him for the map. She was going to lead the clan to migrate. This made him come up with such an inference. After all, even if the Great Priest was stupid, she should know how dangerous it was to migrate on foot. The probability of annihilation was almost 100%, but she still insisted on asking for the map. There were only two possibilities. The first was that they had to migrate or they would be destroyed. The second was that they had to migrate and at the same time they had a special migration method that wouldn't lead to the extinction of the clan. Now that he thought about it, if they were living in the alien spaceship, then the migration was likely to be on the spaceship. In this way, the risk would be much smaller. If this is the spaceship, then the control room is the place where the Great Priest lives? Dean recalled the things that he had seen in the metal cabin. The decoration was relatively luxurious. It didn't feel like the control center of the spaceship. If it wasn't the control room, then the control room should be in another secret place. Perhaps only the Great Priest or the goddess knew about it. But most of the time the Great Priest was needed to open the spaceship. He thought so because the Great Priest didn't hysterically rescue Amelia after she was taken hostage by him. She didn't panic either. At most she was sad. If the goddess was the key to open the spaceship, then Amelia's life was related to the safety of the entire clan. Chapter 861. Dean was relieved. He thought that the Great Priest wasn't able to fully control the spaceship. Or the spaceship had been shot down during the cataclysm and was seriously damaged. The internal defense system and the external attack weapon system were completely ineffective. Or both problems existed at the same time. That's why Amelie's family had been living in the spaceship for generations. But they could only linger at death's door. It must be known that the most basic configuration of such a big ship would be a super wide-range search detector. It would be able to create a 3D map of the nearby area to find the way out, although the Great Priest could predict the good and bad luck of the outside world. However, the range of the Great Priest's prediction seemed to be extremely limited. Blue Fish Lake wasn't far from here. Dean could even hear the movement of the Blue Fish Lake with his own perception. Of course, it had to be a big movement. The only function of the ship is migration. The weapon system has long been ineffective. Otherwise, the Great Priest would have used the ship to sweep the abyss. Dean speculated, the energy of the ship should be running out. Otherwise, the Great Priest wouldn't want to get the coordinates of the wall from me. However, the lights on the roof of the village are still on day and night. From this point of view, the Great Priest shouldn't be able to fully control the ship. He couldn't even adjust the energy-saving mode. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. However, he was also not that interested in such a spaceship. What he wanted to know was whether the database of the spaceship was still there, and whether there was any useful information recorded in it. One had to know that a spaceship with such a structure could not be produced on Earth. At least according to what he knew with his authority, none of the countries on Earth could produce such a weapon of war. The largest known weapon of war was an aircraft carrier. However, this was beyond the concept of an aircraft carrier. There was a 90% chance that this spaceship was an alien spaceship. There was a high possibility that the spaceship contained the secrets of the aliens, including the secrets of the origami and the unknown wild worm. Why didn't you continue to dig? Amelie saw that Dean stopped and seemed to be thinking. She interrupted Dean's thoughts and said in a gloating tone, "Didn't you want to go up? Why are you digging down?" Dean didn't reply. He climbed to the top of the rock wall. As he passed by the origami, he raised his sharp limbs and chiseled the soil that was embedded in the origami. He stuck it to the metal wall and chiseled to the back of the origami. What are you doing?" Amelie was shocked and angry as she saw Dean's action. "You are not allowed to destroy the origami." "Stop." Dean continued to chisel. "Don't be so excited. I won't destroy the origami if it isn't necessary. It's useless for you to say anything if I really want to destroy it. Besides, whether you are the son of the origami or not is still up for discussion." Amelia puffed up her cheeks in anger. "What do you mean? The origami are our ancestors, and you don't even acknowledge that? All I know is that my ancestors were a group of mortals who loved to fight against the heavens. They were not some origami." Dean glanced at her. "I don't know about your ancestors. You said that you are a descendant of the origami and the worm likes your smell. But how can the remains of the origami be preserved here? Don't tell me these desolate worms only eat live ones?" Amelia said angrily, "How would I know?" "Of course you don't know because you are still young." Dean continued to dig and indifferently said, "What you think is what others want you to think. I know that you are not lying, but it doesn't mean that what you said is not a lie. I have a guess, but I don't think you will believe it. In my opinion, your ancestor may not be an origami but a worm." Amelia frowned as she listened to Dean's words. But when she heard the latter part of his words, she became angry. "If you want to kill me, then kill me. What kind of man are you to insult me like this? If what I said is the truth, then it isn't an insult." Dean said, "I didn't lie to you about the body of the worm that disappeared in the passage. The huge slippage was obviously left by another huge worm. We have killed all the way here. It is possible that we have missed a small worm, but do you think it is possible to miss such a big worm? Also, I previously discovered that this desolate worm can be pieced together from different parts. I guess that the great desolate worm was pieced together from the other desolate worm fragment." Amelia was angry. "What does this have to do with me? This is the ability of the desolate worm. Desolate worms don't eat the origami but eat the same kind. These worms live here but there is no prey. What do they rely on to survive? Don't they eat? If they don't eat, then why would they eat you? It shows that they have a need to eat. But when you cut open their bodies, you didn't see any sand. There is no sand in their stomach. It means that they don't eat rocks but meat. So, whose meat are they eating? It can only be the meat of their own kind. They eat the flesh of their own kind while reproducing. Then they eat the reproduced insect. That's probably the cycle," Dean said casually, but his words made Amelia's heart skip a beat. Her anger was completely extinguished by Dean's questions. She wanted to refute, but in addition to cursing, she couldn't think of anything to say. Indeed, the worm liked her smell but didn't hurt the origami. This surprised her. At first she comforted herself that it was because the origami had divine power. But her heart wasn't completely convinced. She just didn't think too much about it. Now she was at a loss because of Dean's repeated questions. She wanted to leave the cave immediately and hand over the questions to the great priest so that she could answer them. She still had a long way to go to become a goddess. She had a lot of things to learn. She used to think that she had a lot of time to learn in the future, so she wasn't very diligent. but now she regretted it. If you are the descendant of the desolate worm, then a lot of things can be explained, Dean said as he dug the back of the origami. The origami is buried in the depths of the cave. You knew that the worm likes your smell, and you loved the origami so much. But you didn't guard the body of the origami. If it was someone else, they would have killed all the worms, but you didn't do so. Chapter 862. Really? Don't forget that the bugs are afraid of fire. Even if they are strong, you can use this weakness to exterminate them. Even if you don't exterminate them, you have to at least move them to a different place if you want to use them to cultivate villagers. Don't you think that it's blasphemy to let them stay together with the remains of the origami? Haven't you thought about this before? Dean casually said. Amelie was speechless for a moment. Either your so-called faith is bullsh*t, and you don't take the origami as your ancestor seriously, or you are actually the descendants of the origami. The great priest or the first goddess and the priest knew about this, but they kept the news under wrap. Then they chose the origami who looked similar to you, especially the upper body of the origami, to be your ancestor. After all, who doesn't want their ancestor to be a perfect human being? It's like some children dislike their parents for being sloppy and ugly or even poor. So they like to have beautiful and rich parents. As the saying goes, a son doesn't dislike his mother for being ugly. But you don't. It can only be said that your ancestors, the first goddesses and the great priests, are too ugly. They don't even deserve to be a human. Dean's expression was casual, but his words were like needles. Amelie's body trembled in anger. Shut up! Are you afraid to know the truth? Or do you think I'm wrong? Dean looked at her. Amelie bit her lips. Her face was gloomy. She suddenly said, You deliberately said that to retaliate against me for my sarcasm. A little bit. Dean took back his eyes from her and continued to busy himself with the things in his hands. So don't gloat in front of me. Amelia snorted coldly and said, What you said seems reasonable, but there are two fatal problems that you did not make clear. First, if the wild worms killed each other, they would have died long ago. How can the speed of reproduction keep up with the speed at which they eat? Second, as far as I know, different kinds of mating can't produce offspring. Our village used to use cattle and wild boars, but they didn't produce any offspring. That's the best evidence. These two questions are also because I am not 100% sure that you are the offspring of the wild worm. Dean's expression was indifferent, but I guess these worms should have a special diet. Occasionally they will eat other things, such as the villagers who came in to explore. As for the problem of reproduction, humans and beasts can't reproduce. But this worm is not an ordinary beast. It may be a parasite. If it has the ability to tamper with its own DNA or other life's DNA, then it is possible to mate with humans and give birth to offspring. If there is an instrument that can verify DNA, then the results will come out immediately. That's why I said that there is an 80% chance that your ancestors are Huang worms and not Huang gods. Amelie inwardly heaved a sigh of relief. You've said so much, but it's all your conjecture. What DNA? I don't understand. In any case, you have no evidence. You're just talking nonsense. As for evidence, I will make an instrument that can verify DNA. Then I will help you find your real ancestor. Dean said, but you can imagine if your ancestors were really those ugly bugs. Based on the situation of the bugs and the origami, they were either symbiotic or archenemies. If it was the first, then it would be fine. But if it was the second, then wouldn't you recognize the enemy as your father? Amelie said in anger. Since there is no evidence, then don't make wild guesses. But you don't have any evidence. You are the offspring of Huang God, aren't you? You! Amelie was angry. Dean didn't pay attention to her as he increased the speed of his blade. The stones fell down and hit the ground with rumbling sounds. Dean chiseled most of the rock wall behind the origami. He was startled when he moved to the position of the buttocks of the origami. He quickly cut out the rock wall and saw a bulging metal block. It was 5 centimeters thicker than the metal wall next to it. Through the X-ray vision, Dean found that the inside of the bulging metal block turned out to be an empty passage. The passage was half a meter high and had the same length as the metal block. Dean's eyes lit up. He didn't expect to find the passage so quickly. Moreover, the passage was behind Huang God. Was it unintentional or intentional? If it was intentional, then the person who placed the Huang God here wanted to use the remains of Huang God to block the passage? Then, what was the other side of the passageway? Dean turned to Amelia. Did the first goddess put the body of the origami in here? Of course, it was buried here after the goddess and the high priest worshipped it together, Amelia said gloomily. She didn't want to answer any of Dean's questions, but she was afraid that Dean would be petty and say something to retaliate against her. She couldn't beat Dean in a fight, so she couldn't withstand such vicious verbal attacks. Dean's eyes flashed as he thought of something. He cut the soil behind the lower body of the origami and then pushed the body of the origami to the side. The body of the origami fell to the ground. Amelie was scared as she saw Dean being so rude. She rushed forward and shouted, "What are you doing?" Dean ignored her shouts. His eyes fell on the raised metal plate. He waved the sharp knife and suddenly hit it. Bang! The sharp knife cut the metal plate, but it still only caused a shallow mark. However, the metal plate seemed to loosen a little, and the surrounding soil also fell. Dean released the demonic form and raised his hand to press the metal board. He pushed the metal board. The metal board was pushed down until it was level with the surrounding metal wall. It looked very smooth. The next moment, the wall above the metal board cracked and revealed a metal passage. It was dark inside, but Dean could see that it was a square passage. It was 1 meter high and 10 meters deep. His X-ray couldn't penetrate the metal inside, so he had to drill in to know where it led. Dean turned back to the ground and said to Amelie, "That's the exit. Let's go in." Amelia was surprised when she heard Dudien's words. She knew that Dudien was using her as a pathfinder. She was dissatisfied, but she knew that resistance was useless. Moreover, she was curious as to where the passage would lead to. Could it be the temple that the great priest had been talking about? The entrance of the passage was only 4 or 5 meters above the ground. Amelie jumped and grabbed the entrance. Dean held Aisha's hand and followed her. Amelia didn't immediately escape after entering the passage. Although it was a great opportunity, but she wasn't familiar with the passage. She was worried that Dean would catch up with her if she got lost. Secondly, she thought that she could use some of the traps in the temple to kill Dean if the passage led to the temple. Chapter 863. Dean looked up and saw a passage entrance more than 10 meters above them. He urged Amelie, "Let's go up." Amelia hesitated for a moment, but still grabbed the handrail and climbed up quickly. When she reached the entrance of the passage, she saw that the passage was 3 meters high and extremely wide. On the other side was a dimly lit room. She was puzzled and slowly walked forward. Dean and Aisha followed her. The room was lit up as Amelia reached the exit of the passage. The room was illuminated as if it was daytime. It was a very simple room. The whole structure was made of bright silver metal. The floor and walls were silver white. There was nothing in the room. It was more like an aisle than a room. The light from the ceiling shined on the floor. Dean, Aisha, and Amelia's figures were reflected on the smooth silver walls. Amelie was startled by the sudden light. She saw her naked figure on the opposite wall. She covered her chest and squatted down. She looked at Dean angrily. "Don't you have a towel or something? Can't you let me use it?" Dean didn't pay attention to her as he used his X-ray vision to scan the surroundings. The material here was the same as the outside. He couldn't penetrate it, so he couldn't directly know the environment here. He could only rely on himself to explore step by step. He looked at Amelie. "I've seen everything. I'm not interested in you. Don't dawdle and continue to lead the way." "You." Amelia was ashamed and angry at the same time. She covered her chest and continued to walk in front of Dudyan. Dean followed behind her. He felt that Amelie hadn't come here before. But he didn't rule out the possibility that she wasn't mentally prepared. Of course, there was another possibility that she was acting. If that was the case, then it could only mean that she had made great progress. Her acting was so realistic that he didn't doubt it. Both of them walked along the aisle. The aisle in front of them was dark. But as they got closer, the lights slowly lit up. It didn't take long before they entered a dead end. They were blocked by a metal wall. Amelie stopped and was about to turn around to ask. Dean went straight past her and went to the metal wall. There was a groove on the wall. It should be a sealed door. There was a glass-like instrument next to the door. Dean looked at Amelie. Come over and try. Amelie reluctantly came to the metal box. What do you want to try? This should be the mechanism to open the door. Try to open it, Dean said. Amelie frowned. Although she didn't believe it, she still looked at the metal box. She looked at the bead that could reflect her face. At this moment, the bead seemed to have sensed something. It turned into a red dot and shot at Amelie's forehead. Then the red dot split and turned into a rotating polygonal net. It rotated on Amelie's forehead. After a moment, the red light converged and the bead returned to its original appearance. Amelie didn't see the rotating polygonal net on her forehead. She was puzzled as she saw the red light disappear. She turned to look at Dean. Dean ignored her and went to the metal box. The glass-like bead seemed to be scanning Amelie's forehead. It seemed to be some kind of identification method, but it was different from the iris recognition and questioning recognition. But it didn't seem to be an attack device. Otherwise there would only be two results for Amelie. Either her identity would pass and the metal door would open, or she would trigger the mechanism and be killed on the spot. But neither of the two situations happened. Her identity didn't open the metal door, nor was she killed. Even if the identification failed, she would be harmless. He didn't have any hope for himself. He just wanted to try it out, so he moved closer to the glass bead. Soon, the glass bead lit up with red light again. A red dot shot on Dean's forehead and slowly dispersed into a polygonal network. The rotating area became larger and larger, and then gradually moved from Dean's forehead to his cheek, neck, right shoulder, and finally stopped. Ka. There was a soft sound. The metal wall in front of him split from the middle and retracted into the metal grooves on both sides. Amelie was shocked as she witnessed the scene. She didn't expect such a magical thing to happen. Dudyan was aware of the movement of the red reticulated polygon. His heart skipped a beat when it moved to his right shoulder. At this time, the metal door suddenly opened. Dudyan thought that it was an attack weapon, but then he knew that the identification was successful. The door unexpectedly opened. From the position of the red light, there was no doubt that it was the flesh of the origami in his right shoulder. His eyes flashed. This gave him a message. This place belonged to the origami. He urged Amelie, who was surprised. Lead the way. Amelie recovered. She saw that Dean was still using her as a pathfinder. She slightly curled her lips and continued to lead the way. After crossing the metal door, they walked straight for more than 10 meters. A bright metal room appeared in front of Dean. It was filled with the same cold mechanical atmosphere as always, but the things displayed in the room made Amelie and Dean completely stunned. The room was like a laboratory. There were several long metal plates similar to operating tables protruding from the wall. On the other side, there were metal cabinets that looked like mortuary cabinet. One of the cabinets was dented. It seemed that it was attacked by something. The traces of being smashed in were sharp like an axe. The other two cabinets were half open. One of the cabinets was empty while the other one was pulled out. There was a corpse leaning on it. Although the flesh on the surface of the corpse was slightly dehydrated, it was well preserved. It was a blond human with blue eyes. His eyes were sunken, and he looked like a zombie. His hair was messy, and he wore a blue and white striped uniform. There was a faint corpse smell coming from the corpse, but it wasn't strong. Dean noticed that the temperature in the room and the passage outside was low. The air conditioning wasn't more than 5 degrees. There was a kind of cold feeling in the room. But the corpse shouldn't be able to be preserved for a long time without rotting. Did this corpse appear here not long ago? Then who put it in? Dean's heart was filled with a burst of cold air. He felt the hair on his back stand up. Amelia was scared by the corpse. The corpse was leaning against the cabinet and staring at her. She almost screamed out loud. Fortunately, she had been with Dean for a long time, so she was used to all kinds of scares. But she still felt a burst of fear. She had never seen such a horrifying picture. She hadn't even seen a corpse a few times. Dean whispered as he felt the fear from Amelia's trembling body. "Do you know this person?" The fear in Amelia's heart inexplicably disappeared as she heard Dean's voice. She turned to look at Dean. Although she felt that his face was extremely hateful and wanted to tear it to pieces. But at this moment she felt a sense of security. She shook her head. "I haven't seen her. But she looks like the people in our village. She should be one of us." She saw Dean's appearance, so she imagined that all the humans in the God's Wall had similar black hair and black eyes as Dean. Dean slightly frowned. Most of the people he had seen after the disaster were from the West. Perhaps it was because he was sleeping in a foreign territory like Russia. Therefore it was hard to say whether this blonde mummy was from Amelie's side or not. After all, she didn't know who it was. He looked at Amelia. "Go and open all the cabinets." "What?" Amelia's voice rose by a few decibels as she stared at Dean. Dean looked at her indifferently. "If you don't do it, then I can let you stay here with them forever." Amelia gritted her teeth. Her good impression of Dean disappeared. She clenched her fists indignantly and slowly moved forward. Soon the anger in her heart was replaced by nervousness and fear. She silently recited prayers and exorcism incantations in her heart. Dean looked around the room. There were a lot of strange tools on the ground. There were also a few small glass jars next to them. It seemed to be a vacuum inside. There were a few dry and flat worms floating in the jars. They were thinner than fingers. The worms looked different. Some had hair on their bodies and some had small blades. It reminded him of the parasitic soul worms in the monsters. Could it be that these were the corpses of the parasitic soul worms? In that case, who was the one who did all of this? At this time, Amelia opened the cabinets one by one. The stench of corpses in the room was getting stronger and stronger. Dean found that there were many corpses in the cabinet. Most of them had blonde hair and blue eyes. He slightly frowned and went forward to check the bodies. He found that there were no wounds on the surface of the bodies. However, there was a round hole the size of a coin on the back of the head of each corpse. He used X-ray vision and saw that the hole was empty. There was only shrunken brain tissue on the top of the head. And in the center of the brain tissue, there was a twisted worm. Amelia looked at Dean holding the head of a corpse in a daze. She could not help but feel a chill. She took a few steps back and stayed away from him. Dean's eyes slowly moved to her. Suddenly, he wanted to open her brain and see if there was any important information about this tribe in her memory. The appearance of the corpses here was too suspicious. Looking at the situation, it seemed that someone used them as an experiment. In his previous speculation, this could be the Origami's spaceship. But the Origami had died long ago. The only people who could experiment here were the great priest and the goddess with the highest authority. But looking at Amelia's performance, it seemed that she did not know. He did not know whether she was too young and had not come into contact with these things, or as a goddess, she was not qualified to come into contact with these things. Only the great priest knew all the secrets of this place. There is a worm in the brain. What is the experimenter trying to create? Is this worm a parasitic soul worm or a young wild worm? Dean frowned. He felt that there was an unimaginable deep connection between the parasitic soul worm and the desolate worm. It was just that the living environment and characteristics of the two made him unable to be sure, but that intuition remained in his heart. He examined the bodies of the two dried corpses and found that he could not deduce their time of death, but at least it was not recent. Their bodies seemed to have undergone some kind of mutation, and with his shallow forensic skills, he could not tell the specific year. After all, his judgment of the time of death was mainly based on his hunting experience, and not professional knowledge. After pondering for a long time, Dean wrote down all the clues and kept them in his heart. He could not infer the result at the moment. Maybe he would get more clues in the future. He glanced at the room. There were obvious traces of fighting. He did not know whether it was caused by the experimenter or by other things. He said to Amelia, "Let's go from here." He pointed to the metal door inside the laboratory. Amelia saw that she could finally leave this suffocating place. She immediately stepped forward and was very active. Chapter 864. What is this? Amelie's face was stiff. There was a trace of shock in Dean's eyes as he looked at the glass containers in the room. There were humans of different ages and genders soaked in them. These humans seemed to be sleeping in the glass containers. Their bodies were submerged in a light yellow transparent liquid. He could clearly see every part of their body. All of them were naked. There were children, women, strong men, old people, and so on. But they all had one thing in common. The lower half of their body was hideous. They looked like monsters. There was no doubt that they were the test subjects of some experiment. But the familiar shape of half-human and half-beast was too similar to origami. Could it be that they were origami? Or were they made into origami? Dean slowly stepped into the room. He felt a cold aura blowing on his face. It seemed that the human test subjects in the glass containers would come back to life at any time. Their skin was soaked in the light yellow liquid, but there was no sign of decay. But the liquid was like stagnant water without a single bubble. It meant that their bodies had stopped breathing, and they had been dead for a long time. Dean could clearly see the condition of their bodies. The bones and flesh were still fresh. There was no decay. But the heart was not beating and the blood was not flowing. They were completely dead. Is it the origami experiment or the insect man experiment? Dean thought of the half-human and half-insect experiment produced by the Monster Research Institute. But those experiment subjects were different from the origami. Their upper and lower body parts, left and right sides, arms, legs and other parts of their body had mutated into an insect. Dean had to rule out other possibilities. But if these were the origami that were being incubated, then did the origami outside come into being? Could it be that the origami were not aliens but experimental weapons made by some existence? However, on the Earth of the old era, such experiments that destroyed humanity were all banned by every country. Even if they were not banned, with the technology of the old era, they might not be able to produce it. It must be known that mixing human and beast limbs meant that DNA technology had reached an extremely terrifying level. If such a terrifying technology existed, then the medical industry of the old era would have long been developed to an unimaginable level. At the very least, most cancers could be easily treated, and even life could be extended. However, in his impression, there had never been an existence with an extraordinary lifespan among the wealthy families of the olden era. For those who were as wealthy as a country, if there was such a technology, they would think of ways to use it on themselves. However, such an example had never appeared. However, if this was not made by the humans of the old era, could it be that it was made by the invaders from Earth? However, the origami protected the humans and stood against these invaders. How could the weapons be created by them? These thoughts flashed in Dean's mind. He was at a loss and his heart was in chaos. He didn't know whether the scene in front of him was a secret in the kingdom of God, which was ruled by the highest human power. Perhaps they already knew about it? Or perhaps they were also studying these things. His face was changing as he stood in the doorway. He didn't move for a long time. There were at least a dozen glassware in the room. There were strange and ferocious corpses floating in the air. It made her scalp tingle. She felt that there was a trace of security around Dean. At least in her mind, Dean was much more kind than the dead and ghosts. Dean slowly came back to his senses. He came to the nearest glassware. There was a 14 or 15-year-old girl floating in the air. Her hair was messy like a ghost. Her eyes were slightly closed and her head was lowered. It seemed that she was looking down at Dean. Dean looked up and carefully observed every part of her body. There was a question in his heart. Were these really origami? Although their strange body structure was very similar, but the size was far different. Could it be that their bodies would become bigger after they were formed? Dean thought for a moment but couldn't find an answer. He turned to the other glassware and looked at them one by one. They were roughly the same. Oriental faces. Dean saw 3 Asian faces. One of them was obviously from China. The other 2 were from a certain island country and a certain shameless bandit country. Although the Westerners couldn't distinguish the differences, but Dean could see the obvious differences at a glance. For example, most of the people from a certain bandit country had small, narrow eyes, single eyelids, round faces, and ugly faces. So cosmetic surgery was popular. Do you know these people? Dean asked Amelie. Amelie was scared by Dean's sudden words. She angrily stared at him. Of course not. Dean nodded slightly. There were almost no Asian faces in the village. It could be seen that these people were caught early as experimental subjects. The reason why they didn't rot was mostly related to the light yellow liquid. Dean pondered for a moment. He saw that there was a passage and a door behind the glassware. He didn't want to stay here any longer. He said to Amelie, "Let's go to the front." Amelie had wanted to leave for a long time. Her face turned bitter as she saw Dean moving forward. She secretly prayed that they wouldn't encounter such a horrible thing in front of them. He scanned his right shoulder and the metal door opened. Dean and Amelia walked in together. Aisha followed behind Dean like his shadow. Behind the third door was a long corridor. At a glance, it was more than 20 meters long and relatively wide. There were no corpses, which made Amelie heave a sigh of relief. But soon, her attention was attracted by the framed pictures hanging in the corridor. Dean was also looking at the photo frames. They were lifelike like photos, but they didn't look like photos. Instead, they looked like extremely realistic paintings that were directly drawn on the wall. Some of these paintings were of origami, some of them were of insects. There were also the Big Dipper and the solar system. The stars of the solar system were surrounding the sun. The sun was red and exuded heat. It was as if a real sun was hanging on the wall. Dean slowly walked along the corridor. His eyes swept through the paintings. His heart was full of shock, but he was more confused. There were scenes of fierce battle between origami and origami. But the origami wasn't the ordinary origami in the cave. They were crystal origami. In one of the paintings, the origami was wrapped around the feet and hands of a beautiful origami. The origami was holding another origami. There was half a piece of meat in the mouth of the origami. On the other hand, the origami in the other painting had a few desolate worms crawling out from its chest, neck, and other parts of its body. It seemed that the origami had been killed by the desolate worms. From this painting, it was clear that the two were opposed to each other. Origami. Amelie looked at the words on the wall. She was confused. She knew that origami was the greatest and unique. But here there were several different faces of origami. Each face was breathtaking and unparalleled. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were perfect. They didn't look like natural faces. There were no flaws. It was as if God had used a brush to carve them. They were perfect and had different temperament. Dean slowly walked and looked at the end of the corridor. Suddenly he was attracted by a star chart. This star chart was different from the previous ones. Other star charts, including the solar system, had many planets around it. It looked incomparably vast. But this star chart was like a Tai Chi diagram. But the two planets weren't black and white. One was blue and the other was red. Far away from these two planets there were bright spots like stars in the sky. The two planets revolved around the star orbits, opposite each other. The reason why Dean was attracted by this star chart was that there wasn't such a special galaxy among the galaxies he had seen. He looked at the star chart for a while and gradually retracted his eyes. He secretly memorized the star chart. He looked back at the other pictures in the corridor and memorized them in his heart. Then he continued to move forward. There was a fourth door at the end of the corridor. Dean scanned and identified it. The door opened. It was a dark passage. Dean once again let Amelie walk in front of him. She was a pathfinder so that he could respond in time if any mechanism was triggered. Walking along the dark passage for a short time, there was a spiral staircase in front of him. Along the stairs, Dean saw a relatively empty hall. It was still a cold silver metal structure, but behind the metal dome, Dean saw a rock formation. He recalled the height he had walked all the way up. Was he already standing at the top of the village, in the canyon? He used his X-ray vision to scan the surroundings. In any case, there was a rock formation outside. It meant that there was hope to leave. Dean didn't find the way out after searching for a moment. Instead, he saw a few huge glass windows, but the material was definitely not glass. How could glass withstand the weight of dozens of tons of rock formation? Dean came to the front of the huge transparent glass and waved his sharp blade. The sharp blade scratched the glass and made a sharp sound. It was as harsh as nails scratching the glass. Amelie covered her ears and screamed. Dean looked at the glass without the slightest trace. He raised his eyebrows and waved his ice claws to hit the glass. Bang! Bang! There was no trace left on the glass. He was startled for a moment. He wanted to slap himself. If this was a spaceship, then this seemingly fragile glass would be the hardest thing on the ship. It was even harder than the metal next to it. He released his demonic body and gave up on attacking. He turned around and looked around. Soon, he found a bean-sized hole in the corner of the wall. It seemed to be used to purify the air. It was connected to a complex pipe that surrounded the interlayer of the metal wall. Dean immediately reached out and stimulated the demonic body again. He waved his ice claws and hit the hole. Bang! The hole was buried in the interlayer of the complex metal pipe. There was a gap in the interlayer. Dean's fist hit the hole and it slightly sunk. Dean quickly punched. His ice claws were unconscious. The entire metal wall and the metal floor under his feet seemed to tremble slightly. Through a few pieces of transparent glass, he could see that the rock formation above was also trembling. Bang! The metal wall collapsed. Dean waved his ice claws to break it open and pull out the metal pipe inside. Then he grabbed the cracked metal wall and tore it along the cracks. The tough metal in his hands was like a piece of tough cowhide. It was torn apart little by little. Halfway through, a 30-centimeter diameter pipe connected to the metal pipe in the mezzanine was exposed. Dean was relieved and a smile appeared on his face. Through his X-ray vision, he had already seen that the back of the pipe was connected to the rock formation outside. Moreover, it was not inside the rock formation, but outside, in the tunnel outside the village. Prelay was quietly waiting with more than a dozen members of the wilderness hunting team. It didn't take long for the time to come. Two wilderness generals who were guarding the door pushed away the boulder and watched Prelay and others go out to hunt. After stepping out of the tunnel, Prelay led the team along the aisle in the canyon. Suddenly a few stones fell down and almost hit him. He looked up and recovered his eyes after seeing that they were natural stones. Next to him whispered, "We almost got injured as soon as we went out. Will there be any accident this time? What are you worried about? Can the divination of the great priest be wrong?" Someone said, "Yes." The man didn't dare to question the divination of the great priest. He changed the topic. "The outsider isn't here. Can we catch so many fish by ourselves?" Seeing that he was talking to him, Prelay nodded and said, "Mr. Dean has already given me the method. When the time comes, you just need to follow my instructions." Mr. Dean and the goddess have been in the Earth Dragon Cave for so long. I don't know how they are doing. Chapter 865. Dean quietly watched as Prelay and the others left. They had stayed in the Earth Dragon Cave for too long. The other villagers had already come out and returned to their usual lives. No one would care about Dean's absence. He was about to leave this place. For him, this was just a small interlude in his journey. The new journey would continue. Next to him, Amelie looked at the canyon. She had stepped on a few loose stones and almost fell down. Fortunately, Dean had pulled her in time. She turned to look at Dean's calm face. There was a trace of complex feelings in her heart. Why did you save me? Save you? Dean looked at her. Even if I didn't pull you, you wouldn't die from this height. You are not the same as before. Adapt to the strength in your body. Amelie was startled. She remembered that she was not the same as before. She had been forced to eat worms by Dean in the Earth Dragon Cave. Her body had been reborn. She had extraordinary strength. She could see far away and could hear the whispers of Prelay and others at the bottom of the canyon. As Dean said, she hadn't adapted to such a powerful body. However, there was an indescribable taste in her heart as she thought that this formidable strength was forced by Dean. Living in the dangerous wilderness, she knew more about the value of strength than Dean. At this moment, she didn't feel how difficult it was to swallow the worms. She had been used to eating the worms. She even liked the feeling of the changes in her body after eating the worms. However, she knew that compared to Dean, there was still a long way to go. Dean's speed when fighting the desolate worm was too much for her eyes to take in, and she was unable to capture it. Are you going to leave here? Amelie asked in a low voice as she bit her lips. Dean looked into the distance and calmly said, Of course, even if I want to stay, you won't welcome me here. Amelie looked at the side of the boy's face. She asked, Where do you want to go? To a place with hope. Dean looked ahead. The world is very big and the place you live in is too small. You can go to the outside world if you have the opportunity. But the premise is that you have to have the strength to travel around. You want to go to the God's Wall, but it is just a big cage. There are many places like the God's Wall. Even the Kingdom of God. They are the place that rules the God's Wall. It is the biggest cage at present. Many divine walls? There is a Kingdom of God? Amelie was shocked by Dean's words. This is what I know so far. The more places you go, the more you will know. Perhaps there is a bigger place beyond the Kingdom of God. Dean didn't hide his information and told her everything. Amelie looked at Dean. Why did you say it's a cage? Don't you want to stay in the divine wall? There are so many desolate beasts outside and they can die at any time. Staying in the divine wall is much safer. There is no place that is always safe. Not to mention that humans don't only have desolate beasts but also their own kind. Just like you think that I am your enemy. Dean looked at her. There are too few people here and you are too high up. Perhaps you will know that everyone wants to be high up and be served by others. But some people aren't born to be high up. They have this expectation so they can only get it through some means. It is either a formal way or an irregular way as long as they can achieve their goal. The irregular way is a shortcut. The shortcut is hidden in the regular way. It is like light and dark, day and night. Only day can't be called a day. It can only be counted as half a day. Amelie was startled. She felt that it was difficult to understand what Dean said. But she felt that there was some truth in it. She instinctively didn't want to recognize it because she knew that the irregular way must be cruel and ugly. We can't go to the divine wall. Although you said that there are many walls but we don't know any of them. Amelie silently bowed her head. Dean quietly said, I said that I will tell you the route to the divine wall before I leave. I will keep my word. You have done your job as a hostage. If you continue to follow me then you will die. Even I can die at any time in the abyss. You will die without a doubt if I take you with me. Amelia jerked her head up and stared at him in disbelief. You're letting me go? You don't want to. No, 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 I am willing. I am willing. Amelie waved her hand. She was afraid that Dean would go back on his words. I will never tell you that I am leaving. I will keep it a secret. No need. Dean indifferently said. I will be gone by the time you go back. It doesn't matter even if you tell the great priest. For me this is just a hotel. I will leave after staying here. Maybe we won't meet again. Amelie was startled as she looked at Dean's calm face. Amelia was startled as she looked at Dean's calm face. She felt that the youth was different from her previous impression. She knew that Dean was serious and there was no need to deceive her with his strength. However, this happiness and hope came too suddenly. She was ready to die. She was even thinking about how to create a movement in the wilderness after Dean took her away from here. She was not mentally prepared for this. Don't you want to kill me to avenge you? Amelie stared at Dean's eyes as she asked. Avenge? The great priest used the beam cannon to ambush you. We came up with the idea together. Don't you hate me? Dean indifferently said. Why should I hate you since I'm not dead or injured? Although you talk a lot, but what good would it do for me to kill you? Now that I'm out of danger, I can write off all the things that happened before. As long as you don't provoke me in the future. Amelie looked at Dean's calm face. She wanted to say something but stopped. She couldn't believe that Dean would be so kind. She knew that in the dragon cave she had seen the man's face. He had used her as a pathfinder. He didn't care about her feelings or life. But now he let her go so easily? Suddenly, she thought of something, and a trace of coldness flashed in her eyes. She bowed her head and didn't say anything. She didn't want to anger Dean and get herself killed. Dean took out a metal cylinder from his backpack. There was a pen and paper inside. He sat on the ground and spread the paper on a piece of thick leather. He quickly drew the map. He stood up and gave it to Amelie. This is the route to the wall where I live. The name of the wall is Sylvia. It's the name of the origami. Amelie took the map, glanced at it, and put it away. He shook his head. You don't have to worry that the map is fake and will lead you to a dangerous place. As far as I know, you should have a way to explore when you asked me for the map. You even have light cannons. I speculate that you should have some other extraordinary detection props. If you are worried that the map is fake, then you can send people to explore it. After all, you won't be able to live here for long. Sooner or later you will need to migrate. Of course you can tear the map if you are still doubtful. Amelie was startled. She didn't expect Dean to directly speak out her thoughts. Indeed, she thought that Dean's gift of the map might be a conspiracy. But Dean had pointed out her thoughts. She had planned to go back and explore the map first. If it was real, then they would migrate so that there wouldn't be a risk of extinction. Why are you willing to give me the map? Is there any danger waiting for us in the wall? Amelie looked at Dean. She wanted to get an answer. She was afraid that her words would expose Dean and anger him. But she still wanted a real answer. After all, they could only detect whether the wall was real or fake. They couldn't detect the danger inside. Dean was dumbfounded. Did I give you a bad impression? Do you need to be so suspicious? Or are you suspicious by nature? Anyway, I have fulfilled my promise. If you are worried, then tear the map and forget that I didn't give it to you. Amelie looked into Dean's eyes. I will verify it. In any case, if you don't kill me today, then I will save you once in the future. It's a good thing to know how to repay kindness. Unfortunately, you won't have the opportunity. Dean looked at the hazy sky. I should go. If I can go back alive, then maybe we can see each other again. Amelie looked at Dean, who was about to leave. She felt guilty and couldn't help but ask, Do you really want to find a way to save your lover? Of course. Otherwise, why would I come here? Dean's eyes fell on Aisha. There was only tenderness and a trace of regret in his eyes. Unfortunately, there are no methods or clues here. I have to go further to find it. Amelie bit her lips but didn't say anything. Dean had explained everything. He whispered to Aisha, Let's go. The breeze blew. Aisha's purple cheongsam was slightly opened. Her snow-white calves were exposed. The scenery was picturesque. Dean took her hand and flew away. In the blink of an eye, he glided into the forest on the other side of the canyon and disappeared from Amelia's sight. After flying into the forest, the calm expression on his face gradually dissipated and he returned to his usual indifference. Whoosh! Dean and Aisha flew forward at high speed in the forest. He used his X-ray vision to observe the environment in front of him and around him to avoid being ambushed by monsters. Dean didn't stop and continued to move forward. He wanted to leave as soon as possible. Although he believed that Amelie wouldn't let the Great Priest chase after him, he couldn't guarantee that the Great Priest wouldn't have the intention to kill him. After all, the latter wasn't like Amelie, who was naive. It didn't take long for Dean to rush out of the forest. On the way, he killed several monsters living in the forest. But all of them were inner barren level monsters. He killed them in seconds. Splitter's terror was once again reflected. Even if the other rulers could kill these monsters, it would take a lot of effort. Only a monster like Splitter could cause the greatest damage in an instant and kill the enemy. Dean slowed down a bit after leaving the forest. He saved his strength and continued to move forward. Half a day later, the sun came out. It was noon, the time of the day when the sun was the strongest, but Dean didn't feel a trace of warmth. The fog in the sky was too thick. The sunlight couldn't shine into the ruins. Chapter 866. Dean pushed away the weeds and moved forward. The weeds were nearly 3 meters high, completely submerging him and Aisha. Their vision was completely blocked. Fortunately, Dean could use thermal response to observe the surrounding environment. Every time he moved a certain distance, he would use his X-ray vision to carefully observe the surroundings. Using X-ray vision consumed too much eyesight and physical strength, but he would use it again after reaching the distance he could observe. Repeating this process, it was a greater guarantee of safety. Through X-ray vision, Dean knew that he was walking in an abandoned street. There were 2 rows of houses around him, but the houses had long been broken. Only the buried cement foundation was still there. Looking from the outside, it was not a street at all, but a wilderness jungle with dense weeds. Occasionally, he would encounter 1 or 2 huge skeletons lying in the grass. These skeletons were extremely large. Some were 4 to 5 meters tall and looked like bulls. Some were 20 to 30 meters long and looked like lizards or giant dragons. It was not difficult to tell that they were once extremely ferocious monsters. But now they had turned into withered bones and were resting in this desolate grass, letting the insects and strange birds rest. Whoosh! Suddenly, a shadow with the same color as the weeds with black spots jumped out of the grass. It looked like a cheetah, but its body was extremely slender. It opened its mouth and a fishy smell gushed out. It bit Dean's shoulder. Dean had long noticed this monster through thermal response. Its hunting level was only about 60, which was equivalent to the general pioneers. He did not avoid it. While it was lying in ambush, he also ambushed it. Bang! His right arm swung out rapidly. With a single thought, a cold light flashed before his eyes. The next moment, the head of the ferocious demon that was biting his shoulder shattered like a crisp eggshell. His right arm smashed straight into its body, smashing it to the ground. There was no twitch or scream, it died instantly. Dean waved his arm, shaking off the brain and blood stuck on it. He sped up and moved forward. After walking for 4 or 5 miles, he returned to normal speed. "Let's find a place to rest." Dean turned to Aisha and said. Although he knew that Aisha would not respond, he was used to communicating with her. After that, Dean glanced around and saw several monsters with low physiques living in the grass. They were far away from him, so there was no need to pay attention to them. Dean found a nearby pile of stones and sat down. He took out a piece of worm's flesh from his backpack and fed it to Aisha. After watching her finish eating, he took out the ribs of a forest tiger that he had killed on the way. Among the many monsters, The flesh of some monsters was edible, like the little blue fish in the blue fish lake. Although it contained a lot of nuclear radiation, and eating it would have a slight effect on the body, in the wilderness one could lose their life at any time, so there was no need to worry about this little bit of radiation. Dean didn't use fire to roast it, so as not to emit too strong a smell. He cut the ribs into finger-long strips, threw them into his mouth and chewed them. His mouth was full of bloody smell. It was a bit pungent at first, but after eating more, he felt it was a bit sweet and delicious. After eating more than half of the rib, Dean felt his stomach was cold, but his whole body had recovered a lot of strength. He looked at the sky. In less than 4 hours, night would come. "Let's walk a little more at night," Dean said to Aisha. Aisha sat quietly and didn't speak. Dean stood up and continued to walk with her. After walking for more than an hour, Dean came out of the jungle. In front of him was a plain, and his field of vision instantly widened. At a glance, he saw dozens of large and small piles of bones piled up on the plain. Some were big, some were small, some were complete, and some were messy. Among them, there was a more than 6 meters long crawling slowly. This thing seemed to see Dean and turned its head. Dean had never seen this monster in the Monster Atlas. In fact, after coming to the Abyss area, there were many monsters that he had not seen or recorded in the Monster Atlas, so he could only judge by the heat response. When this monster looked at him, Dean saw the heat response in its body. It was only at the pioneer level. He was relieved, but still didn't dare to be careless. After all, some monsters knew how to hide the heat response, and even some monsters' heat response in the state of battle was completely different from the usual state. He stood quietly and watched it crawl. Crawled very fast, but it was only at the pioneer level. Dean was relieved. He rushed out quickly and waved his right arm. Bang! The monster's head was torn open, and its body was thrown 7 or 8 meters away. Dean shook off the blood on his arm and didn't stop. He continued to move forward. This was a plain. If he met other monsters, he would be directly exposed. Fortunately, he could see other monsters in advance. When night fell, Dean had already crossed the plain and came to another forest. The environment outside the giant wall seemed to be an addition to plains and jungles, forests, swamps and barren black ruins. Let's rest here. Dean exhaled and looked at the forest in front of him. If it wasn't for the fact that it was getting dark, he really didn't want to spend the night in the forest. In his experience, the night in the forest was the most dangerous. The reason was that the forest environment could collect a lot of rainwater on rainy days, block the sun, and reduce the speed of water evaporation. Therefore, most forests had water sources. Where there was water, there would be ambushes. Dean didn't go deep. Although it was about 4 o'clock, the sky was already dark because of the thick fog in the sky. He jumped on a giant tree branch with Aisha and checked the surrounding environment. There were 2 small heat sources in the front and left 2 kilometers away. There was nothing to worry about. He opened his backpack and took out the undead powder from it. He sprinkled it around the branches and under the tree. Then he used a knife to cut a groove in the trunk, which could accommodate both him and Aisha. It would be their nest tonight. He picked some leaves and interspersed them with branches to make a leaf door. After the preparation, he and Aisha entered the tree hole and covered the leaf door. They were ready to wait until dawn, if they were lucky tonight. Sitting in the tree hole, Dean was always observing the movement around him. He didn't dare to relax for a moment. In this sealed environment, time passed quietly. Silence, stiffness, and loneliness were the enemies of wilderness hunting. The only thing Dean could do was to endure. When night fell, Dean clearly saw that the heat sources around him had increased. A red heat source appeared around him. Some passed in a hurry, some stayed on the ground and seemed to be looking for food. Some met each other and fought with each other. From time to time, the loud roar of beasts became the only song in the wilderness at night. Dean felt a little sleepy at night. He glanced at Aisha and felt that his spirit had recovered a lot. He patrolled the surroundings again. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, the ground suddenly shook violently. Dean was alarmed. He quickly looked and saw a group of ferocious monsters running horizontally from 7 or 8 miles behind him. They rushed straight into the forest, far away from him. He was a little surprised. Through the outline of the heat source, he found that the types of monsters in this group were very different. Ordinary groups of monsters were basically the same group of monsters, but this group of monsters was strange. While he was surprised, he suddenly saw a whistling sound flying up from behind the group of monsters. Then it swooped down and plunged into the group of monsters. For a time, the panicked roars of the monsters rose one after another. Dean's pupils shrank. He found that the flying figure was impressively in the shape of a human. Moreover, the heat source emitted by this humanoid figure was as strong as the sun. It was incomparably dazzling in the dark. He had never seen such a blazing heat source. It was several times stronger than the one he had seen in the giant wall. Abyss Walker. Chapter 867. Dean quickly held his breath to control his heartbeat and reduce the heat in his body so as not to attract the attention of the person. His gaze faded into the light smoke, casually looking at the place where the ladder was. His gaze seemed to stop at that part of the void, not focusing on the person, as he was worried that he would be discovered. Generally, a person with rich combat experience would be able to notice when someone glanced at them. It seemed that the eyes of living creatures could transmit their thoughts. Therefore, an experienced hunter would often be able to keenly sense whether they were being stared at by a hunter or not. Although his eyes were empty, but Dean could still see the heat source figure. Most of the body looked like a human, but it didn't look like a human. Most of the body looked like a human, but there were strange wings on the back. There was a long tail behind the body. It looked like a demonized form, but it could also be a kind of monster. In any case, the heat fluctuations emitted by the other party couldn't be underestimated. His eyes flashed. If the latter was the Abyss Walker, then did it mean that he was about to reach the kingdom of God? Or was there a giant wall nearby? Obviously, the former was more likely. The area near the giant wall had been cleared out. The only place that could survive in the abyss was the kingdom of God, except for Amelia's tribe, which was struggling to survive. The impression that the kingdom of God was too strong. Even the Abyss Walker and the Lord of the Wall had to bow to the kingdom of God. It showed how high the authority of the kingdom of God was. Dean was lost in thought as he thought that the kingdom of God might be in front of him. The kingdom of God was the last place that carried his hope of resurrecting Aisha. He wanted to reach it immediately, but there was some unspeakable fear in him. His thoughts drifted to the kingdom of God. Suddenly the screaming figure that swooped down from time to time paused for a moment. But it was only for less than a second before it returned to its original state. The pause was too short. Even if Dean concentrated on observing, he might not be able to see it. After all, he only saw the image of the heat source and not the real picture. Whoosh! The figure swooped down again and drilled into the crowd of beasts. Suddenly there was a panic beast roar. Dean heard the roar of the beasts and his eyes moved slightly. He slightly shifted his attention to the figure. He saw the figure shuttling through the herd of beasts, and soon caught up with a huge figure that looked like an elephant or a lion. The figure overlapped with the image of the monster's heat source. It looked like the monster was carrying a demon-like human in its belly. The surrounding monsters fled in panic. Several heat sources passed by the monster. As the monsters fled far away, Dean suddenly found that the heat source in the belly of the giant monster was gone. He was startled for a moment. He couldn't help but sweep to other places. After sweeping again, he still didn't see anything. He was startled for a moment. Suddenly, his heart thumped. He kicked open the door in front of the tree hole and pulled Aisha out of the tree hole. Bang! Less than a second after he jumped out, the tree hole was smashed. The giant tree was broken from the middle. A scarlet figure cut the giant tree like a sharp knife. The figure saw that the sneak attack failed, so he stopped. His dark wings gently flapped as he stood in the air like a demon. He looked down at Dean and Aisha, who were standing on the branches of a giant tree. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes when he saw Aisha. Dean's face was gloomy as he coldly stared at the figure. At this moment, he completely saw that the figure was a human. Although the figure's shape was a bit strange, he was sure that it was the eyes of a human. "Friend, where are you from? Why haven't I seen you before?" Baptiste looked at Dean. There was a trace of seriousness in the depths of his eyes, but his expression was very relaxed. Dean replied in a cold voice, "I haven't seen you either. Where are you from?" As he spoke, he glanced at the herd of beasts in the distance, only to see that they had already scattered in all directions. It was clear that the beasts had somehow sensed his presence, but they did not reveal themselves. If not for his high vigilance, the sneak attack just now would have taken his life. The latter was still 7 or 8 miles away just a moment ago, but in the blink of an eye, he was able to quietly approach him. Such speed was beyond his imagination. Was this the power of the Abyss Walker? It should be a fast lurking type. Dean made a judgment in his heart, but he wasn't completely sure. Baptiste smiled faintly and said with a relaxed expression, "I know all the masters in my place. You must be from somewhere else, right?" Dean's eyes narrowed, but his expression was still cold. "Don't ask me where I come from. Tell me, how are you going to deal with the sneak attack?" Baptiste's heart sank, but his expression didn't change. He slightly raised his eyebrows. "What do you want to do? So, you still want to demand an explanation from me?" With this person's speed, he would definitely not be able to escape if he turned around and ran. It would only be a waste of energy, so it would be better to fight head-on. Fortunately, the other party did not directly attack him. It seemed that the other party was also afraid of his strength. After all, this was the Abyss, and those who appeared here were basically Abyss Walkers. The other party should not have expected that he would dare to come here as a mere dominator, so he could still pretend to be pretentious. If he could make the other party retreat, it would be the best. After all, he and Aisha were two different people. Even if Aisha won, she wouldn't be able to retreat. She might even be defeated. Therefore, he couldn't be weak in momentum. Once he was weak, he would be exposed. Otherwise, do you want to forget about it? Dean's eyes were as cold as a sword as he looked at him. "Few people who have provoked me can live in this world. Even if you call all the masters you know, you have to give me an explanation today." Baptiste looked at Dean's tough appearance. He carefully looked at every pore on Dean's face but didn't see the slightest timidity. Although Dean wasn't as skillful as him, but everyone had a different personality. Baptiste had seen too many masters with cold personalities, so he wasn't surprised. There was a trace of retreat in his heart. No matter how he looked at it, he might not be able to gain the upper hand. Even if he won, he would be injured and wouldn't be able to finish the rest of the things. There was a trace of regret in his heart. If he knew it would be like this, he would have come out with those guys tonight. Unfortunately, I can't send a signal to them. I didn't expect that there would be a corpse king hidden here. It seems that its physique isn't low. I've never seen this person who can control a corpse king. I don't know what he used. Damn it. Baptiste's thoughts turned fast. He was more afraid of Dean. After all, there were two of them, and he could tell that Aisha was a corpse king at a glance. The corpse king's physique couldn't be improved too fast. He believed that Dean would never bring a pioneer-level corpse king here. It would be a complete burden. As for Dean's strength, he was also afraid of it. Previously, when he sneak attacked him, he was narrowly avoided. He didn't know whether Dean was aware of him or perceived the flaws in the illusion he created, so he chose to escape immediately. If it was the latter, he had to admire Dean's decisive character. "I thought it was a monster peeping at me. I didn't expect it to be the same kind. If I knew it, I wouldn't have done it. After all, there are monsters running amok outside. We humans should unite, right? Baptiste said with a relaxed face. Since it's a misunderstanding, I apologize to you. I still have something to do. See you later. After that, he turned and flew away with a smile. Chapter 868. Whoosh. Baptiste skimmed through the forest and returned to the herd of beasts in a blink of an eye. He didn't stop and continued to move forward. At the same time, he paid attention to the back. Dean was still on the branch of the giant tree and didn't chase after him. Baptiste was relieved and slowed down a little. There was a trace of coldness in his heart. Brat, you are lucky this time. If I didn't come out alone tonight and called the others, I would torture you to tell me the secret method of controlling the king of corpses. He was jealous and angry. Although he had killed countless zombie kings, it was unimaginable that he could control a zombie king to work for him. It must be known that the corpse king can control other high-level corpses. This characteristic alone is equivalent to carrying an undead army with it. It is completely able to move unhindered in the abyss. Even to many dangerous places, it can use the undead to explore the way. In addition to this ability, the most valuable thing was the growth of the zombie king itself. In terms of evolution, the zombie king, like other zombies, relied on eating flesh and blood to evolve. This was extremely terrifying compared to humans. It should be known that humans needed concentrated god's marrow to evolve from hunter to limitless one. From pioneer to dominator, they needed legendary magic mark. These harsh factors greatly limited the number of human powerhouses. But the zombie king didn't need to care about these at all. As long as there was flesh and blood, the speed of evolution depended on the quality of the flesh and blood. Some people would ask, if that was the case, why were some zombie kings only at the pioneer level? The reason was very simple. Although the zombie king's growth was heaven-defying, its intelligence was too low. Most of the zombie kings only had instinct and simple consciousness in the early stage. This instinct was to control other zombies and eat. So most places with zombies had zombie kings. When the zombie king commanded the zombies to attack the prey, even if the prey was killed, there wasn't much meat left in its mouth. After all, the zombies were crazy about fresh meat. The zombie king in the early stage didn't even know how to control the zombies and kept the spoils for itself. This basic selfishness that humans and even most creatures understood did not exist in the zombie king's mind. Only when the zombie king had evolved to an extremely powerful level would it have wisdom close to ordinary animals or even human beings. It was precisely because of this that the growth of the zombie king was greatly limited. Like most zombies, the zombie king didn't choose its opponent. Even if it encountered an opponent it couldn't match, it would continue to attack. As a result, sooner or later it would step into the territory of an existence it couldn't resist and be directly killed. The zombie king was like a piece of peerless steel. With human wisdom, it was like forging this steel into a sharp weapon or a treasure armor. It was invincible in attack and unbreakable in defense. It was precisely because of this that Baptiste was jealous of Dean. As far as he knew, no one could control the zombie king. Even the supreme beings in the kingdom of God couldn't do this. Whether it was in the place where he lived or in the kingdom of God, he had been secretly studying this problem. But no one had been able to do it for hundreds of years. Although some people had tried to control the zombie king, it was just a simple control. Soon they were killed by the zombie king. After all, when the zombie king evolved, its intelligence would also slowly evolve. Using some long-term experimental methods, it was indeed possible to control the zombie king, which was almost unconscious in the early stage. But when the zombie king evolved to a certain level, it would devour its master. This kind of thing had happened more than once in history. He didn't know which method Dean used, but he knew that the beautiful, elf-like elegant woman beside the boy was definitely not a pioneer-level corpse king in the early stage. If this matter is spread to the kingdom of God, it will cause a sensation, at least among the big shots. Baptiste thought maliciously. It was a pity that he didn't know where the boy came from. If he knew the giant wall where the boy lived, it would be easier to deal with him. As long as he spread the news, it was estimated that the giant wall would soon become the target of all forces. After walking for 10 minutes, he was already hundreds of kilometers away from the boy's position. This was the result of not rushing at full speed. He was always paying attention to the possible hidden monsters behind and around him. He didn't see Dean chasing after him. Although he met some powerful monsters along the way, he quietly avoided them. After all, his magic mark ability was very good at hiding. It seems that this boy is also a coward. He doesn't dare to chase after me. If it were me, I would have caught up and killed him. Oh, when I sneak attacked him, he hid in the tree hole. It's ridiculous. Baptiste couldn't help laughing in his heart. But before he could laugh, he suddenly stopped. After a few breaths, he slapped himself in the face. Bastard! I can't believe I missed this. Baptiste quickly turned around and ran back the way he came. Along the way, his figure flew and dashed. He was both anxious and angry in his heart because he had actually overlooked this crucial point earlier. It was simply unforgivable. If that boy is the abyss, why would he hide in the tree hole in the periphery of the Devil's Pit? There are only a few dominators around here. I'm so stupid, Baptiste regretted. He had previously regarded the boy and the Zombie King as two abyss walkers, but now it seemed that the boy was at most a dominator, and the Zombie King was probably the same. With such strength, he could only mix in the periphery of the Devil's Pit. Moreover, he still hid in the tree hole at night with obvious means to cover his track. It was clear that he was afraid of being found by the monsters. Baptiste would occasionally stop to rest in such an area, but he would never be so careful. He quickly went back and forth, wishing he could slap himself. He was the dignified abyss, but he was scared by a dominator, or even a kid who was not even a dominator. It was a shame. Dean watched Baptiste leave. He used his clairvoyance to lock Baptiste's figure until Baptiste's figure flew out of his field of vision. After half a minute, Dean took Aisha's hand and calmly left. The reason why he was so calm was because he was pretending to be calm. He had no choice but to act calm. After all, he did not know the range of the other party's perception. If the range was larger than his field of vision and the other party saw him fleeing in panic, the other party would most likely come back to kill him. After slowly flying in the opposite direction for thousands of meters, Dean estimated that the other party had either escaped far away or had once again hidden his figure and secretly followed him. He couldn't show panic, so he continued to fly forward calmly. In his mind, he was thinking about how to deal with the second possibility. It was not that the second possibility was more likely. On the contrary, his intuition told him that the guy should have escaped far away by now. But his survival experience told him that treating the most dangerous possibility as the one with the highest probability was the way to live longer. Let's verify whether he is behind me or not. Dean's eyes flashed and his figure slightly accelerated. He ran from the side of Aisha to the front of her. Their figures overlap. If one looked from the back, they wouldn't be able to see his movements unless they had clairvoyance. He quickly took out a small bottle and a roll of almost transparent silk thread from his backpack and hid the bottle in his sleeve. He hid the bottle in his sleeve and wrapped the transparent thread around his hand. He looked at his surroundings and rushed into another part of the forest. Dean wasn't so afraid of the forest in front of him after he saw the scene of the man driving away the monsters. He faintly guessed that there might not be two strong monsters in the vicinity. Dean jumped from tree to tree after entering the dark forest. His movements looked very natural. In fact, it wasn't strange for him to jump from tree to tree. After all, there were more dangers on the ground than on the branches. Chapter 869. Dean rushed out of the forest after arranging the warning thread. He didn't stop but continued to move forward until he reached a hill about 20 miles away from the forest. He found a rocky hill and hid there. This was almost the limit of his thermal vision. Through the heat source, he could see the monsters in the forest. If these monsters were close to the warning thread, then the trap would be triggered. At least he would be able to distinguish whether they were the pursuers or not. However, he knew that he could not fully rely on this little warning device. After all, he knew nothing about the enemy's abilities. However, since he could reach the abyss level, other than having extremely terrifying abilities in certain aspects, he would not be too inferior in other aspects. Dean gasped for breath. He took out the water from his backpack and drank a few mouthfuls to restore his strength. At the same time, he was thinking about the follow-up preparations. Whoosh! Baptiste returned at full speed. Along the way, he made a big noise and alarmed some monsters. But the monsters seemed to be aware of his murderous aura. They only chased for a few steps and stopped. After all, with his speed, it would be a short time for him to pass through the territory of the monsters. Most of the monsters didn't want to fight with a strong enemy unless their territory was invaded. In the abyss, it was hard for humans to survive. The same was true for monsters. Once they were injured, they would become food for other monsters. Damned brat, when I catch you, I'll tear your face apart. Baptiste was angry. In less than a quarter of an hour, he returned to the previous forest. When he arrived at the tree hole, Dean was already gone. Baptiste had expected this, but he was even more angry. He was more convinced that Dean had slipped away. His gaze followed the branches and extended into the distance. In the pitch-black forest, between the countless densely packed branches, there seemed to be a path that only he could see. That path was like a trail of glowing footprints, guiding him in the direction he was following. "It's your bad luck to meet me," Baptiste sneered. His tracking ability was not as good as his hiding ability, but it was ranked second among his many abilities. Because he could track and hide, he dared to come to the edge of the Devil's Pit in the middle of the night without worrying about being ambushed by other high-level monsters. Whoosh! His silhouette flew out, shaking the branches and making them rustle. His silhouette shot out like an arrow, and after a while, he rushed out of the forest and continued moving forward. Along the way, he passed through plains, grass, and a forest that was more than 10 miles in diameter. He's actually walking in a straight line. The smell is still strong. He shouldn't be too far away. A cruel glint flashed in Baptiste's eyes. He was surprised that Lin Fan did not try to erase his aura. Was it because he was fearless? Or was he really an idiot? Clearly, even if one reached the ruler level, they would understand this basic common sense. However, in his view, Dean didn't erase the smell. Obviously, he intended to fool him like before, but he wouldn't be fooled again. Baptiste sneaked into a branch of the forest. The smell was getting closer and closer. The hostility in Baptiste's eyes became more obvious. He grinned and moved forward. Suddenly, his silhouette stopped abruptly. It was as if a picture had been paused for a moment. The pause was extremely abrupt, but the surrounding breeze and the clouds above the forest showed that it was not a time freeze. Just this ability to stop abruptly was enough to make most experts exclaim in admiration and envy. Baptiste squinted and his eyes fell on a leaf that he was about to touch. The clouds above the forest dispersed and the moonlight shone down. Baptiste saw it clearly. It was a thread. In fact, he could see it clearly even without the moonlight because he was looking with his nose. His gaze followed the extremely well-hidden thread and saw that it was entwined around the giant branches in front of him. Moreover, it was entwined in places with lush foliage. It was so well hidden that even someone with good eyesight would not be able to detect it. He glanced at it, and the scarlet color in his eyes deepened. There was even a hint of a smile in his eyes. Clearly, this was a trap left behind by that youth. From this, it could be seen that the youth was afraid of him. He was now 100% sure that this youth was definitely not an abyss walker like him. "Little devil, you're finished," Baptiste sneered in his heart. He moved slightly and went around the area where the transparent silk threads were entangled. After successfully bypassing the giant trees, he looked around and saw a monster that looked like a cheetah or a big cat perched on a big tree. He took out a lump of sugar from his pocket and threw it into the middle of the giant trees. Then he turned around and continued to move forward. This time, he was not as fast as before. Even the breeze was light and did not make any noise. At the current temperature, the sugar will melt in 3 minutes. The mucous membrane inside will loosen and emit the fragrance of meat and soil. 3 minutes later, the trap will be activated. This is the time when you are most relaxed. Whether you are the master or the abyss, you will die. Baptiste was like a hunter sneaking into the night. His eyes were cold and cruel as he moved quietly in the night. Following the smell, he soon came to the hilly area. His eyes locked on a hill. The smell is still here. Humph! Does he want to ambush me here? Baptiste sneered. When he was about to approach, he suddenly stopped. A glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. I see. This is the real trap. If he knew that he was no match for me, then the silk thread in the forest was an early warning device. Since it was an early warning device, this place must be an ambush. But he did not hide his scent, so this is also an early warning device, and it is likely to be a trap. 2 warning devices. Baptiste sneered. As long as I take action, he will know. His original body and the king undead should have hidden their smell and traces. They should be hiding nearby and can't go far. Thinking of this, Baptiste stopped. He carefully used his ability to simulate the shape and characteristics of the surroundings. At the same time, he looked around, searching and distinguishing with his sense of smell. Even if a certain method was used to erase the smell, there would always be something left behind. It should be known that, in addition to a person's body secreting sweat to release the smell, there would also be a person's original smell on their clothes and boots, or the smell of places they passed by. There were too many of these smells, and it was impossible to completely eliminate them. Even with his special stealth ability, he couldn't do it. As long as he was careful enough, he could find the flaws. However, he knew that he didn't have much time left. When the thread was touched, it should be when the youth was most vigilant and most relaxed. If he were to appear beside him at this moment and launch a sudden attack, he would absolutely be able to kill him in one strike. However, 3 minutes were almost up. Baptiste was anxious to find Dean in the remaining time, but the anxiety didn't affect his body. Fragrance of flowers, moist soil. Baptiste was like a hound as he carefully searched. Suddenly, the sound of a strong gust of wind came from afar. Although it was said to be a gust of wind, only his hearing could hear the sound of branches swaying in the forest 20 kilometers away. Moreover, he had to divide part of his attention to pay attention to the movements in that area. Only then could he hear it. The sound of the wind was like a giant tree suddenly bouncing up. He knew that the silk thread was broken. The time was up. His face sank as he missed the best opportunity to attack. He calmed himself down and continued to focus on the search. A few minutes later, Dean heard the sound of a stone being smashed somewhere. His eyes flashed, but he didn't look back and continued to move forward. Baptiste searched for a few minutes but still couldn't find Dean. He knew that there was no point in continuing to disguise himself. Dean must have known that he was here. He stopped lurking and rushed to the source of the smell. He saw a white towel hanging on a stone. Below the towel, a few words were engraved. "Idiot, congratulations!" Yes, there was an exclamation mark behind the word. It was full of malice. Baptiste was so angry that his mouth almost twisted. He immediately punched the stone, and with a loud bang, the stone broke into pieces. When he smashed the stone, he suddenly came to his senses. He couldn't help but want to curse out loud. He suspected that the words on the stone were deliberately left behind by the other party to provoke him, and the sound he made when he smashed the stone just happened to remind the other party. This was another warning device, and he had clearly seen it, but he had triggered it himself. Chapter 870. Baptiste couldn't be humiliated. He didn't even get hurt by Dean, but there was a feeling of extreme humiliation in his heart. He slightly gritted his teeth. The anger in his heart made him want to roar, but he held back this time. He didn't want Dean to take advantage of his roar to quietly move forward and use his roar to cover the sound of his own actions. He couldn't be fooled a second time. He controlled himself to calm down and recover his mood. The anger turned into a raging, killing intent in his heart. He scanned every inch of soil around him, checking every leaf and weed on the ground, looking for Dean's footprints and smell. However, he checked again and didn't find Dean's footprints near the stone. He suddenly understood that Dean, or the King of Corpses, had the ability to fly. Looking at the vast night sky, Baptiste flew up and smelled the faint smell in the air. He clenched his fists and his eyes were gloomy. He knew it would be very difficult to find Dean again. He, the dignified Abyss, was deceived and even humiliated by a dominator. The hatred in his heart almost swallowed the whole hill under his feet. He suppressed his anger and continued to search nearby. In the forest, Dean slowly wriggled forward. It was very difficult for him to wriggle because he hid himself and Aisha inside a python. The python was not dead, but it was not far from death. It was at his mercy. He was using the python to cover the smell and heat source. He believed that as long as the King of Corpses didn't have X-ray vision, the King of Corpses wouldn't be able to detect him. After all, he had covered the smell before he drilled into the python. Although it wasn't completely covered, it was difficult for the King of Corpses to detect him. Moreover, he could also use the python's heat source to cover the weak heat emitted by his body. Dean knew that his second warning worked when he heard the sound of stone breaking. He didn't stop but continued to wriggle slowly. At this time, he used his X-ray vision to penetrate the python's body and saw a figure flying in the sky. It was the Abyss. The Abyss was scanning the ground while flying, but it didn't seem to notice the difference in the python. With the size of the python, its body was just a little bit after swallowing two people. It didn't even squeeze out the outline of a human. Dean stayed for a moment and continued to wriggle forward. 10 minutes later, Dean saw the Abyss fly back and disappear in the distance. He didn't drill out of the python's mouth, but continued to control the python to wriggle forward. Half an hour later, he saw the Abyss pass by again. But this time it didn't fly over his head. It flew over the forest a dozen miles to the left and rushed into the distance. Dean smiled bitterly in his heart. It seemed that his words made the Abyss angry. There was no clue, but it didn't give up. It wasn't afraid that such a blatant search would attract other monsters. He stayed in the python's body and wrapped around the tree. He looked up at the moon and waited quietly. It didn't take long for Dean to see the Abyss come back again and fly into the distance. He didn't pay attention to it. He controlled the python to coiled around another tree and waited for the night to pass. This time the Abyss didn't appear again. It seemed that it had given up. Dean still didn't come out of the python's body. From time to time, he controlled the python to swim for a distance. His body was used to the sticky python's body. Unknowingly, the night passed. Dawn appeared on the horizon. It seemed that there was hope. Dean suddenly had some understanding when he saw the ray of sunlight. The God and faith pursued by all living beings were like the light of dawn. No matter how dark the night was, it could tear it apart and bring hope and light to the people who were struggling in the darkness. Unfortunately, it won't appear at night. This is the rule of the universe and the rule of life. Dean looked at the warm dawn and sighed in his heart. Hope was beautiful. He never denied it. Unfortunately, hope always came too late. The saddest thing was that hope would never come in advance because it would only bring greater despair. Just like the early arrival of dawn, it would lengthen the time of the day. It would affect many factors and cause the collapse of the biological chain. All of this was the rule of creation. The only thing that could change was to become the king in the long night. He thought sentimentally, but soon he put away his thoughts. The day was coming, and he should get down to business. Judging from last night's situation, this abyssal expert is good at hiding and tracking. I don't know if he chased the beasts away to hunt them or if he had some other purpose. Those beasts were mostly at the pioneer or innermost level, and there wasn't even a single dominator among them. To the abyssal, hunting such monsters is too low a level. From what he said, I don't know if he's bluffing, or if there really is an abyssal expert in his place of residence that matches his strength. Logically speaking, this shouldn't be a divine kingdom. After a night of escape and a long wait in the Python, Dean thought of a lot of things. Aristotle went to the kingdom of God for 10 years. Back and forth, it could be seen that the road to the kingdom of God was long. Although it was impossible to spend all 10 years on the road, it shouldn't be so close to the kingdom of God. It must be known that the time he spent on the road to here from the giant wall was not long. From this it could be concluded that the kingdom of God was not nearby. The abyss was either the existence of other giant wall or the abyss like Amelia. Dean felt a headache. Most of the time, he felt that information was far more important than combat power. He didn't know what the situation was in other giant wall. He only knew that the abyss was the Lord of the Wall. But in addition to the Lord of the Wall, were there other abyss? Dean felt that the strength of each giant wall should be uneven. At least the Lord of the Wall was stronger than Sylvia's giant wall. After all, they were able to send 9 such strong masters across the abyss to find Sylvia and almost kill all the masters of Sylvia. This was something that Sylvia couldn't do. If the abyss came from other giant wall, then Dean felt that he could deal with it. But if the abyss came from the abyss, then things would be tricky. For him, the giant wall was the official force of the kingdom of God. Although he didn't know the strength of the giant wall. Maybe there were 2 or 3 abyss masters and a lot of dominators. But in contrast, the abyss was more terrible. After all, he had no way of knowing what the abyssal remnants had in their hands. For example, the Amelia tribe was weak, but they had a terrifying weapon like the laser cannon. Moreover, they were living in a super aircraft that seemed to be the Aragami's spaceship. I should be able to find clues related to him from the direction where he expelled the beasts yesterday. No matter which possibility it was, he intended to take the risk to get close to it. If it was the giant wall, then at least he knew the position of the giant wall. If it was the abyssal survivors, then he needed to find a way to kill the person from last night and then break into their interior to see if there was a way to treat Aisha. After making up his mind, Dean crawled out of the mouth of the half-dead python. He cut its belly and pulled Aisha out. Both of them were a bit embarrassed, but they were used to such things in the wilderness. Dean took Aisha and rushed out of the forest. They flew along the plains outside while paying attention to the surroundings in case the abyss stayed in the vicinity. Although the possibility was very low. After a moment, Dean found a trampled road full of mud. It was the road that the beasts had passed through last night. From time to time he could see the corpses of monsters on the ground. The smell of the abyss lingered in the air. Chapter 871. Whoosh! A figure landed in a basin on a hill. The basin was rather humid. At this moment there was a bonfire in the center of the basin. 4 people surrounded the bonfire. One was sleeping on a rock next to the bonfire, one was playing with a knife in his hand, carving wood, and one was hugging a furry animal in his arms, gently stroking it while staring at the bonfire in a daze. Hearing the noise, one of the women sitting by the bonfire with her eyes closed said, "You're back." The other two turned around and saw a tall and thin figure walking slowly from the basin. His skinny face looked gloomy under the light of the bonfire. It was Baptiste. He did not say anything but sat down on an empty spot by the bonfire. He picked up a piece of firewood and threw it into the fire. Felicia slowly opened her blue eyes and looked at Baptiste. She frowned and said, "Why do you smell like blood? Didn't I tell you that you can go out for a stroll? But when you come back, you must clean up the smell. Don't let it affect our plan tomorrow." "I'll do it later," Baptiste replied weakly. He didn't dare to be angry with this woman. He could only be depressed. Whenever he thought of the words on the stone wall, he couldn't help but grit his teeth and clench his fists. The regret in his heart made him feel aggrieved. However, he was the one who caused it, so he had nowhere to vent his frustration. Phinea's blue eyes were pure and clear. She looked at Baptiste and frowned. What happened? What can happen to him? He must have been unable to find a suitable target to practice with. The young man who was carving wood looked up and said with a smile. Baptiste rolled his eyes at him but didn't conceal anything. He said, "When I went out for a walk tonight, I bumped into a man. Judging from his armor, he shouldn't be from our place. He should be from one of the god walls around here. There are other abysses here." Hearing Baptiste's words, the others looked up at Baptiste with interest. Felicia frowned and asked the middle-aged woman who was hugging a furry animal, "Is there another divine wall nearby, Viftel?" This middle-aged woman with a slightly masculine name was extremely beautiful. Just by looking at her appearance, no one would believe that she was already over 50 years old. Her skin was as white as jade, and her oval face was delicate and elegant. She looked cold, elegant, and charming at the same time, cute. She stroked the furry little animal in her hand while her other hand took out a scroll from the bag on her back. She opened it and looked at it, then shook her head and said, "No, within 3,000 miles around here, there is no divine wall." I knew it. Which divine wall would be so close to the devil abyss? The young man who was carving would laugh. Felicia frowned and looked at Baptiste. "Have you fought with that man? How strong is he? Middle or lower? Or a higher position?" Baptiste sighed and shook his head. Felicia, Wefteler, and the young man with carved wood couldn't help but be moved. Baptiste saw their expressions and knew that they had misunderstood him. He didn't want to talk about it, so he said, "If I'm not wrong, that man is just a ruler." "A ruler?" The others were surprised and then relieved. Felicia glanced at Baptiste and asked, "What's so special about this ruler?" The young man with carved wood also saw Baptiste's strange expression and joked, "You wanted to kill this ruler but he escaped, didn't you?" Baptiste didn't expect that his guess would be correct. He couldn't help but glare at the young man and snappily said, "You talk too much." "Really?" Wefteler was surprised. The youth with carved wood laughed and said, "You know Baptiste's personality. He suddenly saw a person in the abyss, and a ruler at that. It would be strange if he didn't capture him as a toy. Look at his dejected face, he obviously failed. But it was just a random guess, I didn't expect it to be true." "Haha, Baptiste, you actually let a ruler escape from your hands. Amazing!" The corner of Baptiste's mouth twitched. He coldly stared at the young man and said, "He escaped from my hands. With your ability, he can run around in circles. Do you believe me?" The young man with carved wood smiled. "Yes, I believe you. Who doesn't know how good you are at tracking? But if it was me, he wouldn't have the chance to escape. If I see him, he will die in my hands. Do you believe me?" Baptiste's eyes were spitting fire. "What do you mean?" "Enough." Seeing that the two were about to quarrel again, Felicia frowned and said, "Baptiste, tell us what happened first. This person is only a ruler, and yet he dares to come here. He must have some extraordinary ability." She deliberately said this to give Baptiste a way out of this embarrassing situation, but she knew that being able to escape from Baptiste as a ruler was not something that could be described as extraordinary ability. Baptiste snorted, speaking of which, it was my oversight. I was having fun when I suddenly saw that kid hiding in a tree. When I sneaked up on him, he noticed me and dodged in time. I didn't know if he was an abyss or a ruler. Most importantly, he could control a corpse king. There was a beautiful corpse king beside him, and it gave me a dangerous feeling. I thought that the corpse king was also an abyss. Even if I won, I would probably be injured, and it would affect tomorrow's operation. The young man with carved wood smiled. He didn't say anything, but his meaning was clear. You were scared. What does that have to do with tomorrow's operation? Baptiste looked at him coldly and continued, After I left, I realized that the kid might not be a ruler, so I went back to check. Sure enough, he slipped away. He is quite good at hiding. I searched for him for more than 2 hours and still couldn't find him. If Vifteler was here, he would be dead for sure. Felicia's blue eyes flickered as she said, You mean, this person can control the undead king? Yes. Baptiste thought of the key point he wanted to say. I don't know where this kid learned it from. I suspect that this kid is not from the other god walls. He might be a remnant of the abyss. Didn't someone say that there are survivors from the previous era in the abyss? Someone once saw traces of the abyss's activities here. I suspect that this kid might be a remnant of the abyss. Felicia asked, Have you talked to him? Do you know what language he speaks? Baptiste said, It's the common language of the abyss. If it's the common language of the abyss, then what's there to doubt? The young man with carved wood said impatiently. Baptiste rolled his eyes and said, Wouldn't the remnant of the abyss sneak into the abyss to learn it? There is no way to control the corpse king in the abyss. Which monster research institute in the abyss would dare to not hand it in? Phinia nodded and said, We don't know where he's from for now, but it seems like he's still nearby. Although a mere sovereign can't affect us, we don't know the rank of the corpse king he controls. In any case, Viftel, pay more attention to the surroundings. Don't let anyone pick up any loose ends from behind. Yes, I will. Vifteler nodded and touched the furry animal in his hand. When we get back, we can tell the master about this person. He has always been interested in the undead. If he knows that someone can control the zombie king, he will try to find this person at all costs. By then, we will be considered as the ones who provide the information. If it is valuable, we might get a big reward. Felicia smiled and said. Baptiste smiled in his heart. The reason why he told them such a shameful thing was to use the Lord's hand to take revenge. Go and clean up. It's almost dawn. We should get ready to leave, Felicia said to Baptiste. Baptiste nodded and looked at the sky. He got up and left. Dean followed the footprints of the beast. He didn't walk fast as he didn't want to bump into the abyss on the way. He hid his aura all the time and sneaked all the way. He came to a hilly area after more than an hour. There were no footprints of the beasts nearby, but there was still the smell of the abyss. Dean smelled other scents in the air, including the faint body fragrance of a woman. Dean was shocked. Cold sweat oozed out of his back. There was someone else here? Was there more than one abyss? He wanted to turn around and leave. If it was only the abyss from last night, even if he encountered it, he was confident that he could escape. However, judging from the smell in the air, there were at least 4 people. If all of them were abyss, he probably wouldn't be able to escape even if he had a pair of wings. He stopped moving forward and slowly retreated. The tension in his heart slowly relaxed as he retreated further and further. He couldn't help but think that if all of them were abyss, then why did they come here in a group? Were they here to hunt a monster? Wait. Apart from the kingdom of God, which wall had so many abyss? Dean wasn't sure if all 4 scents were abyss, but he was sure that there were at least 2 abyss. Otherwise the abyss wouldn't have left 4 dominators there and come out alone. Gathering so many abysses at once, if all of them are abysses, then it would be equivalent to 5 wall lords. So many people came here just to hunt a monster? What else is there in the abyss besides monsters? Survivors of the abyss? Relics of the previous era? Dean speculated in his heart. These speculations made him more curious. He couldn't wait to follow them again to find out. But reason told him that he wasn't the protagonist of a novel. He didn't have such good luck. Even if the other party came to find a treasure, he could only stare at them with his little strength. In that case, wouldn't it be stupid to risk his life just to feast his eyes? You go your way and I'll go mine. I'll give you the face of your companions this time. But if we meet again in the future, whoever is weak will be unlucky. Dean thought about it in his heart, but then he felt it was funny. He and the other party had turned back to look for each other, but after looking for each other, it was to no avail, and they could only end up resentfully. Seeing that the sun had risen, Dean no longer thought about it. He continued to move forward along his original track. He was going in the opposite direction of the previous hill he had explored. He only prayed that this direction was the opposite of the abyss last night and not the same route. To be on the safe side, he decided to move 300 miles horizontally and then continue to the north. This time, he was even more cautious on his journey. After all, the abyss and his companions could appear at any time last night. It was also possible that they would run into each other while chasing a monster. If that was the case, he could only blame his bad luck. Chapter 872. Puff. A rock lizard's head was cut off and its body fell to the ground. Dean looked around and quickly squatted down. He cut open the body of the rock lizard and took out the soul bottle from his arms. This was a special bottle that could quickly extract parasitic soul worms from the body of a monster in the wilderness. The bottom of the bottle had the scent of the parasitic soul worm, the parasitic soul worm's favorite. He inserted the bottle into the broken neck of the rock lizard. Blood flowed out. After half a minute, there was not the slightest movement from the cut flesh. Dean sighed. He knew that this rock lizard was not a monster. He took back the bottle and continued to move forward. He had never seen most of the monsters in the abyss, so he could only rely on the soul-luring bottle to identify them one by one. However, he did not kill them many times, and some of them looked like ordinary monsters at first glance, so he did not bother to verify them. Only some of the more cunning monsters with some special abilities would he test them. For example, this rock lizard had disguised itself as a rock and lurked around him. He didn't notice it at all. It showed how strong its camouflage ability was. Fortunately, its strength was average. It was only at the pioneer level, so it didn't cause any harm to him. The magic mark of Splitter on my chest is gone. Only the magic nest is left. Fortunately, I can still use Splitter's ability. I don't know if it will also be removed after I cut off my right arm. After all, the magic mark was swallowed by that thing. Dean was a little upset as he thought about his own situation. The changes in his right arm made him feel uneasy. If it wasn't for the fact that cutting off his right arm would also remove Splitter's ability, he would have already done it. In the past 2 days, he saw that the frozen flesh within half a centimeter of the golden sarcoma in his right arm had turned into a light golden color. Apparently, it was infected by the golden sarcoma. When the golden color spread to his body, he felt that his brain might be invaded again. This made him very depressed. Although the monstrous power of his right arm had increased, he would rather not have this card if he could abandon the danger in his body. Unfortunately, it was not up to him. After moving horizontally for 300 miles, Dean continued to move north. Although the journey was boring, he had to be careful. Puff. Dean launched a surprise attack and beheaded a monster that looked like both a cow and a mouse. He took out the soul bottle and aimed it at its broken neck. 10 seconds later, Dean saw a slight bulge on the back of this weird monster. It seemed that something was swimming over. His eyes lit up. He used his X-ray vision and saw a blood-red bug. It was the parasitic soul worm. Soon, the parasitic soul worm drilled into the soul bottle. When Dean screwed the bottle cap, the parasitic soul worm seemed to realize that it had fallen into a trap. It fiercely struggled in the bottle, knocking against the bottle. Dean put the bottle into his backpack and quickly left the place with Aisha. They came to a messy pile of stones. He sat on a piece of concrete and looked around. After confirming that it was safe, he asked Aisha to guard him. Then he took out the syringe and the corresponding props from his backpack. He wanted to verify whether the parasitic soul worm could still be a nutrient for his body without the magic mark of splitter. Soon, the blood-red bug in the soul bottle was turned into a mass of mucus and sucked into the syringe. Dean took off his armor, lifted his shirt, and looked at the faint scar in the center of his chest. Through his X-ray vision, he could see that there was a bubble-like thing inside. The surface was a layer of membrane, but around this bubble-like nest, there were many extremely fine hair-like blood vessels. In a sense, this part of his body no longer belonged to the scope of human structure. Dean took a deep breath and injected the parasitic soul worm into it. The dark red mucus quickly filled the nest. From the surface, it looked like a red birthmark. It was very soft and bulging. Dean stared at it, feeling the changes. Time passed, but the burning sensation didn't appear. Dean looked at the parasitic soul worm mucus in the devil's nest, and his face slowly sank. He continued to wait for more than 10 minutes, but there was still no change. He could only put away the syringe and the soul bottle, put on his clothes and armor, and felt complicated and lost. Do I have to inject it into the golden sarcoma to have an effect? This golden sarcoma has to be removed sooner or later. If I remove it, the magic mark of splitter will also be gone. Won't my strength directly decline to the bottom? He sighed in his heart. If he encountered such a situation in the giant wall, he could immediately make a choice, and would not be so tangled and embarrassed. But in this dangerous abyss area, he did not want to easily abandon his right arm, and he did not want to risk losing the magic mark of splitter, which meant that he was likely to lose his X-ray vision, heat-sensing ability, and his demonic body. At that time, he might not even be as good as an ordinary pioneer. Removing the golden sarcoma was not good, but not removing it was also not good. Dean felt annoyed and powerless. Suddenly, he thought of the abyss he met before. If there is no kingdom of God nearby, and the other party used the common language of the giant wall, then there should be a certain god wall nearby. If it is a god wall, then it should be a very powerful one. I don't know if the god wall is also divided into different levels. Anyway, if I can find a god wall and sneak in, at least it will be safer than in the abyss area. At that time, I can take the opportunity to inquire about the situation inside, and find a chance to get other legendary magic marks, and then remove this sarcoma. In that case, even if I lose the magic mark of splitter, I can have other legendary magic marks to replace it. This was the last resort, but compared to other options, it was the best solution at present. Although replacing the magic mark of splitter made him very hesitant, there was no other way. With the speed of the golden sarcoma, it was estimated that in 4 or 5 days, it would spread out from his right arm. At that time, he would face more dangerous problems and headache. If he was not pressed for time, he could return to Sylvia, where he could at least guarantee that he could get a legendary parasitic soul worm. If I replace the magic mark, it is estimated that I will fall from the Dominator level. Generally, the limit of the legendary magic mark is the inner wilderness level, and only the deified legendary can bear the body of the Dominator. I don't know what level the magic mark of the Abyss Walker is, but there should be a higher existence above the legendary level. Dean sighed in his heart. Eating the flesh of the origami was really a wrong choice, and now he had to pay a heavy price for this mistake. He stood up. Although he had made a decision, The premise was that whether he could find the nearby god wall was still unknown. After all, the area of activity of the Abyss Walker was too wide, and it was difficult to say whether the god wall from the Abyss Walker was nearby or not. The monsters around the god wall are generally of low levels, so I should have a chance to find it along the direction of the low-level monsters. Dean recalled the distribution of the monsters he met along the way, and soon found a strong and weak route, but this route was in conflict with his northward direction, which was in the east. Dean immediately walked along the east side. Anyway, there was still a long way to go from here to the kingdom of God, so he was not in a hurry. Maybe he could find some unexpected harvest in the god wall in the east. Moreover, he had only seen Sylvia, but not other god walls. After seeing it for a while, maybe he could compare the differences between the god walls and some secret. Along the way, most of the monsters he met were of the pioneer level. As Dean walked farther and farther to the east, the monsters he met were getting weaker and weaker, which proved that his previous choice of route was right. At night, Dean stopped to rest, ate the flesh of the monsters he hunted, and drank some water from the huge pit on the side of the road. In the next day, he continued his journey. In the blink of an eye, 3 days had passed. Dean traveled 1,000 miles a day. In just 3 days, he had traveled more than 3,000 miles. The reason why he could travel so fast was that most of the monsters on the route he took were pioneering-level monsters. Occasionally, he would meet the Dominator-level and Inner Wilderness-level monsters. As for the Abyssal-level monsters, he had only met 2 of them. He had bypassed them in advance so he didn't disturb them. If I can't find the god wall by the day after tomorrow, I can only cut off my arm in this wilderness. Dean glanced at his right arm that had turned into an ice claw. The golden sarcoma on his shoulder was spreading more and more. In just 3.5 days, it had expanded to more than 1 centimeter. He found that the parasitic soul worm mucus that was injected into the devil's nest in his chest had unknowingly dried up a lot. He didn't know if the 2 were related, but he planned to extract the parasitic soul worm mucus tonight. If his body couldn't absorb it, it would only rot in the devil's nest, and it would bring germs and make the body sick. After 3 days of travel, Dean didn't meet the traces and smell of the Abyss Walker again. He felt that he should be far away from that person or that team of people. Dean flew out of the jungle. In his thermal vision, there was a limitless level monster 3 miles ahead. He rushed directly toward it. This monster was like a huge rabbit, furry, but the pointed ears on its head were not furry, but sharp black ears like the horns of a bull. It turned to look at Dean, and its scarlet eyes were full of hostility. Just as it was about to open its mouth to scream, a cold light flashed and blood burst out. The monster's head fell and rolled on the ground. Dean took out the soul bottle and moved closer. Soon, a centipede-like parasitic soul worm crawled out of the monster's blood and drilled into the bottle. Another one. Dean screwed the bottle cap. In these 3 days of travel, he had killed thousands of monsters, including 12 named monsters. Including the one in front of him, there were a total of 13 parasitic soul worms. Among the thousands of monsters, there were many monsters that he didn't think were named monsters, so he didn't test them. After taking the parasitic soul worm, Dean continued to move forward with Aisha. He looked up at the setting sun. The warm light made him feel as if he was strolling leisurely under the setting sun. As he walked along the east side, he did feel relaxed. The monsters he met along the way were much weaker than the ones he met before. As he walked, a ray of sunset flashed past his eyes. In the weeds in front of the jungle, a towering giant wall stood in the distance, like an ancient city wall. Dean was startled and stopped. He raised his hand to cover his eyes to confirm that he was not hallucinating. It was the giant wall. He was stunned for a few seconds before he reacted. There was an inexplicable sense of excitement in his heart. This was the second giant wall he had seen besides Sylvia. Back then, were those invaders also like him, crossing the mountains and valleys from the abyss to attack? I don't know if this wall is the place where the abyss lived, or a wall similar to Sylvia, or a weaker place. Dean's eyes flashed. If it was a weaker giant wall, he didn't mind being an invader and running away. He cheered up and rushed over with Aisha. As he got closer and closer to the giant wall, he used his X-ray vision to observe the surroundings of the giant wall in case of an ambush by sentries. Although there was no such setup in Sylvia, it didn't mean that other giant walls wouldn't do the same. After searching for a while, he didn't see any sentries. Dean spread his magic wings and flew up with Aisha in his arms. The 1,000-meter-high giant wall quickly got closer. Dean flew to the top of the giant wall. The width and shape of the top of the giant wall made him feel particularly familiar, as if he had returned to the top of Sylvia's giant wall. He quickly went to the other side of the giant wall and looked around. He saw green mountains and rivers, a piece of lush forest, and a beautiful environment. There was no trace of people living in the place where he could see. He knew that the place close to the giant wall had serious radiation and was a barren area. Although the environment seemed beautiful, but there were many mutated beasts and low-level monsters hidden in it. I didn't expect to find a second wall in this abyss area. Speaking of which, the nearby 1,000 miles should not be regarded as the abyss area. I haven't even met a monster of the Dominator level within 1,000 miles. It seems that the distribution of the abyss area is the farthest barren area outside the giant wall? Dean thought. He felt that he could faintly overlook the distribution of the world. The giant wall stood at the farthest edge of the giant wall. The place that hasn't been developed is the abyss area. In addition to the lack of development, it may be because of the Devil's Pit in these places. Aristotle's notes recorded that the Devil's Pit is the deepest place in the abyss. The closer to the Devil's Pit, the stronger the monster. It is obviously not suitable to build the giant wall around the Devil's Pit. The Devil's Pit is a geographical environment that can't be changed. So the giant wall was built far away from the Devil's Pit. Chapter 873. Dean flew down and landed in the giant wall. The radiation value here was significantly lower than outside. The air he smelled was particularly fresh and natural. There was no strange smell. He originally planned to find a place nearby to solve the problem of his right arm, but he finally came across a new giant wall. He was very curious about the environment inside. Was it the same as Sylvia's? Most importantly, what about the level of the masters here? He converged his aura. After more than 200 miles, he saw the stables and the shadow of the villages and towns inhabited by humans. Although more than 200 miles was a long distance, but the land inside the giant wall was very vast. It could easily accommodate tens of millions of people. More than 200 miles of wasteland was nothing. No walls. Dean was surprised. He had encountered a lot of mutant beasts and low-level monsters along the way. They were comparable to the existence of hunters. The thick wood of the stables seemed to be strong, but it had no protection in front of such mutant beasts. If it was Sylvia, at least there would be a golden wall to protect her. Although the main purpose of the stone wall was to isolate the barbarians who were also humans. Dean looked at the number and strength of the residents behind the stables. All of them were ordinary people. Only 6 of them had high heat. 2 of them were standing at the other side of the stables. They seemed to be guarding the stables. Their combat power should be slightly higher than the average scavengers. They were about 3 to 5 times stronger than ordinary people. Dean stopped Haisha in the distant forest. He quietly went into the village and found a lone high-heat source. He caught him and brought him to the distant forest. The man who was caught by Dean looked to be in his 30s. Dean threw him to the ground and saw Dean's appearance. He was scared by Dean's ferocious splitter armor. His face turned pale as he trembled. Who are you? He was speaking the common language of the giant wall. Dudian knew that there wouldn't be a language barrier after the capture. From this point of view, it also reflected the difference between here and Sylvia. Answer my questions honestly and you can go back alive. There is no need to say the rest of the nonsense. Do you understand? Dean's eyes were indifferent. There was a murderous look in his eyes. The middle-aged man was scared and nodded. With the cooperation of the middle-aged man, Dean finished what he wanted to know after 10 minutes. Then he knocked out the man and left with Haisha. I didn't expect this place to be more real than Sylvia. Blatant privilege system. Dadian bypassed the village and continued to move forward. Through the words of the middle-aged man, he knew that the reason why the village was assigned to this place was because they had to pay tribute to the Lord. All the residents here needed to pay tribute to the Lord in exchange for asylum. The Lord here was similar to the aristocratic Lord in Sylvia. They had the power of life and death in the territory. But there was no commercial district here. There were only territories and a large number of servants, residents and serfs. Every lord had a large number of soldiers. The lords fought with each other for land and resources. Every time a war broke out, the residents of the border of the territory would be the first to be affected. It could be said that the people here suffered from the ravages of war all year round. Although the aristocratic lords of Sylvia would also compete with each other for territory and wealth, but there were few direct wars. Most of the battles were open and covert in the business world. They would take care of their face. When the situation was stiff, there would be Knights' Hall and the military to mediate. But there was only one king's city here. From the words of the middle-aged man, unless the lord was too extreme and wantonly slaughtered the residents of other territories, the king's city would intervene. It seems that this place is much simpler and rougher than Sylvia. Strength is king. Poor civilians can only live in fear. Every time there is a war, they have to migrate. If their lord wins, it's fine. But if they lose, they are likely to be implicated in the massacre or reduced to the lowest servant of the new lord. Dean's eyes flashed. King's City was the center of power here. It was also the place where the big shots lived. It was hell for the poor and heaven for the rich. Now he wanted to go to the King's City to have a look. It would be best if he could find a legendary parasitic soul worm before replacing his right arm. Moreover, the parasitic soul worm he had collected in his hand was also identified by the monster encyclopedia on the wall. After all, the owners of these parasitic soul worms were killed on the way here. The monster encyclopedia given by the Kingdom of God should be different from the one in Sylvia. After passing through villages and towns, some were prosperous, some were down and out. It didn't take long for Dean to come to the most prosperous town he had seen so far. At a glance, the roads of the town were paved with stones. It was in sharp contrast to the dirt roads of the other villages and towns outside. Moreover, the population of this town was very large. Hunter-level guards could be seen everywhere. Before coming to the town, Dadian had taken off his armor and hidden it with his backpack in a nearby forest cave. That cave was the cave of a monster that was close to level 20. There shouldn't be any problem if the monster was guarding it. He was afraid that the monster would be scared away and wouldn't dare to return to the cave. Let's test the water first. Dean looked at a large building in the center of the town. In front of the building was the most prosperous and lively square. There were several buildings and blocks around the square. There were all kinds of shops. Behind the square was a very spacious luxury manor with several elegant villas. When he came to the square, he could see through the iron fence outside the manor that the gardeners and servants were trimming the lawn inside. For the desolate village he had first met, this town was already a paradise. But this manor was more like a place where the gods lived. It was clean, tidy, elegant, and very stylish. But this style was what Westerners liked. Dean was not interested in it. He used his thermal sense to sweep in and soon saw a heat source figure. The whole villa was covered with hot spots, like countless infrared rays shining on it. Among them, there were 3 heat source figures which made Dean more surprised. They turned out to be pioneers. In the manor of the first lord he met, there were 3 pioneers. Additionally, it did not rule out the pioneers who were hiding in the dark and instinctively knew how to hide the heat source. Dean was a little surprised. In Sylvia, except for the Witcher family and the military of the Inner Wall, there were basically no pioneers. Dean narrowed his eyes and looked up at the sky. He was ready to take action at night. Late at night, Dean turned over and sneaked into the manor. Although it was more than 11 o'clock in the evening, the manor was still brightly lit. Looking at the situation, Dean estimated that the lights would not go out all night, so he simply did not want to wait any longer. The servants in the manor had fallen asleep in the basement under the manor. There were groups of red dots in the basement, but on the exquisite villa, there were only a dozen red dots, which were relatively scattered. Dean chose a figure who was always accompanied by a red dot of a pioneer and sneaked over. This should be the lord of this place. Most of the lords here were protected by pioneers, mostly because the lords here struggled to break away from each other. They were always on guard against sneak attacks, but this just provided him with an obvious target. Phew! Rozek exhaled softly and leaned back in his chair. He had finally finished his work. Although he seemed to be enjoying life on the surface, he was actually very tired every day. He had to take care of all the affairs in the territory, big and small. Moreover, he also had to manage the few shops under his command in the royal capital. These matters sounded simple, but for an ordinary person, being the manager of a shop was enough to be overwhelmed, not to mention managing everything in such a large territory. Fortunately, he had a lot of capable subordinates who helped him simplify and concretize things. Otherwise, it would take him several days to look through these complicated things. "Sir, you have worked hard." Next to him, a young man in dark blue armor bowed his head. Lozek smiled and said, "I say, don't be so tense all the time. Wearing this armor is very tiring. It's my duty. In case of enemies, I can also block them for sir," the young man said respectfully. Lozek smiled faintly, but before he could say anything, the young man suddenly dashed forward with a murderous aura. Lozek's pupils shrank. His first thought was, "Have you been bought by those guys?" Chapter 874. Dean looked at Lozek. From his appearance, he should be the lord here, but his physique was only at the ordinary level. Dean could see the bone structure in his body through X-ray vision. There was no mutation and the strength was not high. He was not a master of hiding heat. He took a step forward and said, "If you are smart, don't yell." Lozek looked at Dean, who came out of the shadow with an ugly face. Dean was definitely a master to be able to sneak in here quietly. Lozek glanced at the young man in front of him. He didn't know if the young man could deal with him. The young man's eyes were full of killing intent. He said coldly, "Who are you? Which lord sent you here?" "I'm just here to talk about something. Don't be nervous." Dean's words were not in response to the young man, but to Lozek. "Considering that you may be disobedient, it's necessary to make you docile. I can only sacrifice you as a subordinate." The young man saw Dean walking forward, completely ignoring him. He was angry, but he couldn't be timid. With a low roar, he entered the demonic state. Thick hair grew all over his body, making him look like a werewolf. His arms turned into claws, and his leg bones were bent, which was more suitable for explosive attacks. He rushed toward Dean, and his scarlet eyes were full of hostility and killing intent. Dean continued to walk forward steadily as if he didn't see anything. When the young man rushed over, he didn't see how Dean did anything. Bang! The young man's body came to an abrupt stop. His head was grabbed by a huge ice claw, and he couldn't make a sound. Crack! Like a walnut breaking, the young man's head exploded in the ice claw. Brain juice and blood overflowed, and his body suddenly softened. Dean casually threw the young man aside like throwing out a pile of garbage, and continued to walk toward Lozek. Lozek's pupils shrank as he looked at the scene in horror. He was aware of the strength of the youth. He was his most trusted guard and also the strongest guard in his territory. How could he die in front of Dean? He did not see Dean reveal his demonic body. Although he was just an ordinary person, he was a lord after all. He knew how the pioneers fought. Only by revealing their demonic body could they exert 100% of their strength. However, Dean just pinched casually and subdued and killed the young man. It was a complete crushing. His heart was beating wildly, and he was somewhat out of breath. He stared at Dean in a daze, as if he saw a devil approaching him. The smell of death was so thick that it suffocated him, and he did not dare to breathe. "Don't be afraid. I won't kill you." Dean's voice was very calm. It seemed that he was the master of this place. Dean came to the desk in front of Lozic. They were only separated by a table. Dean said, "Now we can talk. I have some questions that I hope you can answer truthfully. Otherwise I will be very unhappy." Lozic's expression was unsightly. He was both nervous and afraid. He had never felt so close to death before. His voice trembled as he said, What do you want? I can give you money, territory." Dean shook his head and interrupted him. "I don't need anything else. Can you help me get a legendary parasitic soul worm?" Legendary parasitic soul worm? Hearing Dean's words, Lozic was a little relieved in his heart. He quickly said, "Yes, this is not a problem." Dean was a little surprised. He didn't expect that Lozic could understand the legendary parasitic soul worm. He was worried that the name would change because of the differences between the giant walls. He wanted to explain, but now it seemed that the name of the legendary parasitic soul worm should be issued by the Monster Research Institute. It was a unified title set by the Kingdom of God. However, Lozic agreed too quickly. It seemed that this matter was not difficult. "No problem." Dean looked at him and said, "Don't speak too early. This thing must be delivered to me within 3 days. Otherwise, you and your territory will disappear, including your children." Lozic's heart tightened. He quickly said, "No problem, I will deliver it." Dean was a little surprised to see that Lozic agreed without any reluctance. The legendary parasitic soul worm was so rare that it was not easy to get it. Although Lozic was a lord, he knew from the information that there were many lords here. Lozic was not a big deal. He thought for a moment and asked, "I want a living one that can be implanted into my body immediately. Where can you get it?" Hearing this, Lozic was stunned for a moment. A strange look flashed in his eyes. This time it was his turn to be surprised. He did not expect that Dean would ask such a strange question. But then he thought that maybe Dean was worried that he was fooling him, so he deliberately tested him. "Tomorrow, oh no, tonight, I will send someone to the temple in King's City to buy it. You can get it tomorrow afternoon." "Don't worry, sir," Lozic quickly said. Although the legendary parasitic soul worm was very expensive, compared to his life, he could still afford it. "The temple in King's City? Purchase?" Dean's eyes flashed a trace of surprise. He thought for a moment and asked directly, "Did you buy the legendary parasitic soul worm from there?" "Yes," Lozic said without thinking, but there was some doubt in his heart. Dean's questions were too strange. With Dean's strength, he seemed to know nothing about it. Did he not buy it from the temple? Did he go hunting outside the giant wall? How much manpower would be wasted? Dean glanced at him and guessed his thoughts from the doubt in Lozic's eyes. But he did not deliberately hide it. He was more curious about this giant wall. The legendary parasitic soul worm could be bought directly from the temple. And from Lozic's performance, since he bought it from the temple, most of the other lords did the same. In other words, the number of legendary parasitic soul worms sold in the temple was astonishing. And in a place with so many legendary parasitic soul worms, it was not difficult to cultivate deified legendary parasitic soul worms. In other words, there was at least a dominator in the temple, or even a stronger abyss. "Can I buy it at any time?" he asked again. Lozic was stunned. Yes. Dean raised his eyebrows. What kind of force could provide legendary parasitic soul worms at any time? Who was behind this force? He did not ask further. He felt that the temple should be related to the Monster Research Institute. He asked again, "How many lords like you are there?" Lozic felt that Dean's questions were very strange, but he was not sure whether Dean was asking about the number of lords in this area or the number of all lords. He immediately said, "Sir, there are 5 lords like me in this area. But among all the lords, there are at least 30 or 40 of them with similar strength as me." Chapter 875. Show me the Monster Illustrated Handbook. Dean made another request. Since he wanted to replace Splitter's magic mark, he naturally had to find a comparable legendary parasitic soulworm. Of course, it would be best if he could find a better one. Lozic was stunned. He didn't understand, but he still said, "I don't have the Monster Illustrated Handbook. If you want it, can I take you to get it now? Have someone send it over." Dean glanced at the young man's body and said, "Be honest. You know what to do." Lozic's face slightly changed. He responded, "Yes, I'll have someone send it over." Then he called out to the corridor outside, "Butler Gully." After calling twice, footsteps quickly came from outside. Lozic waited for the footsteps to come closer and said, "Don't come in. Go and find the Monster Illustrated Handbook." "Yes, master." As soon as he finished speaking, the footsteps faded away. Dean had long noticed the person waiting in the corridor outside. The previous roar of the young man had alarmed the person. However, it seemed that Butler Gully didn't expect the enemy to sneak into the room. Although he heard the noise, he didn't come close. After all, he didn't know what was going on inside the room through the thick door. Without Lozic's order, he didn't dare to disturb Butler Gully. After a moment, the footsteps returned. Lozic opened the door a crack. He didn't wait for Butler Gully to speak and took the booklet from Butler Gully's hand. At the same time, he ordered, "Wait outside. No one is allowed to disturb me without my order." "Yes, master." After closing the door, Lozic came to Dean with the booklet and handed it to him. Dean saw that Butler Gully was honest and didn't say any secret code. After Butler Gully left, he returned to his original position and continued to wait. He didn't move to other places or contact others. Dean was relieved and picked up the booklet to read. At first glance, he was a little surprised. On the first page of the Monster Illustrated Handbook, there were legendary monsters listed in order. The first monster was marked with a ranking, number 1. This number 1 monster was called Supplicant. The name sounded like an astrologer, but the sketch sketched next to it was an extremely ferocious and strange humanoid monster. It had a snow-white outer shell that looked like a cloak, and on both sides were protruding scapulae. At first glance, it looked like an old scholar's snow-white robe. It was rather elegant, but above the protruding scapulae was a pointed head. Below the head were 6 eyeballs that looked like whirlpools. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a simple character. Sure enough, the types of monsters near each giant wall are different. Splitter can be ranked 4th among the 8 legendary monsters in Sylvia, but in the comprehensive ranking of all the legendary monsters around the giant wall, it may be ranked in the top 10 or even lower. It seems that the strength gap between the Dominators and the Abyss is very big. Dean thought. In the giant wall of Sylvia, the Dragon Clan was the leader of the 3 exorcist families. It was because the Dragon Clan's magic mark was several levels stronger than the Wing Clan's Bat Clan's magic mark in frontal combat. They were both pioneers, but the Dragon Clan could easily defeat the Wing Clan's pioneers. His Splitter was the same. When he was still a pioneer, he could easily kill other pioneers. The sharp blade of the Splitter was invincible. Although the other pioneers had various abilities, they might not be suitable in a head-on fight. For example, some pioneers had the ability to investigate, some could hide, and some could use poisons and concentrated acids. However, they were all killed before they could use their abilities. After all, Splitter did not have these strange abilities, but in terms of attack, it had achieved the extreme. This point alone helped Dean to look down on his peers. Dean had also seen the abilities of the petitioner. Although the latter was ranked number 1, he was still surprised. The petitioner was good at 3 aspects: camouflage, lurking, magic attack, and sky eye. These 3 aspects combined the 3 most important areas of camouflage, attack, and reconnaissance. The only weakness was probably its defense. But the defense here was only relative to these 3 abilities. In fact, in terms of defense, it was better than many legendary monsters, such as Dean's Splitter. It's a multifaceted legendary monster, a bit similar to the Dragon Clan. Although its attack is slightly inferior to Splitter, it can spit high-pressure liquid fire, which has a miraculous effect on some monsters and enemies. Moreover, its defense is several times stronger than Splitter. Even Splitter can't cut off the Dragon Clan of the same level with one knife. Instead, the Dragon Clan will rely on its super high defense and attack to defeat it. Dean narrowed his eyes slightly. In terms of comprehensive ability, this supplicant was much stronger than the Dragon Clan. Camouflage, reconnaissance, attack, relying on reconnaissance to determine the strength of the enemy, relying on camouflage to sneak close, and attacking to kill. Such an enemy was simply the Grim Reaper in the shadows. No wonder it was called Supplicant. Once you were targeted, you could only pray. Dean was excited to see this legendary monster. Although Splitter was good, but Supplicant's magic attack wasn't weak. According to the description above, the magic attack was just a name. Supplicant's body would secrete a high concentration of magic energy. In Dean's view, this magic energy might be radiation energy. Supplicant seemed to be able to control and gather this energy at will. It could inject it into the enemy's body or scatter it for long-range attack. No matter which point it was very terrifying. If a large amount of radiation energy was injected into the enemy's body, it was enough to cause instant death. Although its attack wasn't as straightforward as Splitter, but the effect was better. For example, hunting a stubborn enemy like Wild Worm that could survive even after its body was cut off, Supplicant's magic attack could directly destroy it from the inside. Dean looked at the second monster, the Charm. This Charm's ability was very specific. It had the same ability as the word charm in its name. It had a very strong charm ability. It could charm most of the enemies, and could even make enemies and monsters that were much stronger than itself relax their vigilance and reduce hostility. In addition, it was not good at attack, defense, lurking, investigation, and so on. This introduction surprised Dean. Charm the enemy? How to charm? This was the real world. Could it be that this demonic creature could use demonic arts? He continued to read and soon understood. There was a trace of shock in his heart. The shape of the charm was very small. It was similar to a butterfly and belonged to the flying category. Its charm mainly relied on the special powder emitted from its body to create illusions and false impressions to the enemy. It could even make the enemy regard it as their own kind or their own natural enemy. Dean finally understood why a monster that was so weak in frontal combat could be ranked in the legendary list. Moreover, it was ranked second only to the triple omnipotent Supplicant. It turned out that Supplicant relied on one trick to eat all over the sky. Although this charm ability was very weak in frontal combat, if used well, even the Supplicant couldn't compare to it. Most importantly, in the face of more powerful monsters, this thing's survivability was far better than other monsters. Creating illusions is a bit similar to the Dream Breeder, but the Dream Breeder is directly controlled by poison, and can produce a long-term illusion enslavement effect. Moreover, the Dream Breeder is one of the best poison attacks, and has a strong frontal combat ability. But this Dream Breeder can only rely on the illusion to create a frightening effect, or a cordial effect. The real power to kill the enemy is very weak. Strong, but too single. Dean's eyes flashed, thinking about the role of the spirit charm. He sighed in his heart. If the ability of the spirit charm was reflected in the supplicant, then it would be really perfect. If it was added to the splitter, it would be even more perfect. If it was added to the high-pressure liquid fire and defense of the demonic dragon. The more Dean thought about it, the more he felt that if the abilities of these legendary monsters were integrated into one body, it would be simply an invincible perfect creature. But he also knew that the moon waxed and waned, and there was no perfect thing in the world. If he had to choose, the supplicant was still better. After all, he didn't want to just scare away some enemies to resolve the resentment in his heart. Cutting the weeds and eliminating the roots was what he loved to do. Dean continued to look down. The legendary monsters at the back also had their own special abilities, and each was different. But the legendary monsters at the back were more mediocre, and their effects were even similar to the legendary monsters at the front, but in terms of strength, they were hundreds of times weaker. However, the number of legendary monsters here surprised Dean. There were a total of 37 types. Sylvia only had 8 of them, but there were 37 of them here. The odd number was almost close to the total number of Sylvia's legendary monsters. Chapter 876. Seeing Dean looking at it for so long, Lozic was secretly trying to figure out Dean's identity. When he heard Dean's words, he smiled bitterly and said, "Sir, this supplicant is the #1 legendary monster. It's hard to find. Do you want to change it? I'm asking you, can you get it?" Dean narrowed his eyes and said coldly. He could hear that Lozic did not refuse. It seemed that there was a chance, which made him a little excited. Originally, he did not have much expectation. After all, Sylvia was the #1 dream breeder, but she was elusive and only existed in history. He thought it was the same here. Lozic's mouth was bitter. He wanted to be tactful and mention that the supplicant was hard to find so that Dean would mistakenly think that he could not get it. He did not expect Dean's attitude to be so rude and direct. Lozic could not refuse in a roundabout way. However, if he shook his head and said no, in case Dean went to other territories and learned about this matter, he would most likely come back for revenge. Lozic could not afford a master like Dean to assassinate him. "I can get it, but it will cost a lot of money," Lozic said pitifully, but he was interrupted by Dean. "No matter how much it costs, you must get it." A hint of surprise flashed in Dean's eyes, and he said without hesitation. He didn't expect Lozic to have a way to get it. Lozic was just a random lord he met, and there were 30 or 40 lords who were similar to him. But such a small lord could get the #1 legendary monster here. It was incredible. However, he believed that Lozic was not lying because there was no need to. Even if Lozic was worried about angering him, it was not necessary to force himself to do something that could not be done. On the contrary, it would anger him more and the risk would be greater. Lozic slightly opened his mouth and was speechless. He thought that it was easy for Dean to say it, but it was not his money. However, he only said this in his heart. If he really said it out loud, he didn't know what Dean would do. From Dean's previous murderous attitude, he knew that the young man in front of him, who seemed to be in his early 20s, was absolutely a ruthless master. "Did you buy it from the temple?" Dean asked. Lozic smiled bitterly and said, "It can only be obtained from the temple. Don't you know this, my lord?" Speaking of this, he slightly raised his eyes to look at Dean, but his eyes were very clear, without any doubt. Dudian knew his thoughts. "It's not good for you to know too much. You just need to do things for me and I'll give you some benefits. But if things go wrong then I don't need to say the consequences." Lozic's heart skipped a beat and he hurriedly said, "Don't worry, sir. I will handle this matter properly for you." "How long will it take?" Dean asked. Lozic thought for a moment as he saw Dean was in such a hurry. The supplicant is the strongest legendary monster. Its parasitic soul worm needs to be booked in advance. Generally speaking, it will take half a month. If you are in urgent need, you might want to consider the second most powerful monster, the spirit. You can buy it in about 10 days. As for the monsters outside of the top 10, you can get it in 2 or 3 days. He glanced at Dean and saw Dean's thoughtful expression. It seemed that Dean was not suspicious. His heart was slightly relieved. In fact, there was something he didn't say. That was, if he spent double the price and took care of the relationship inside, he could even get a legendary parasitic soul worm like the supplicant within 3 days. However, thinking that Dean didn't seem to understand these things, he took the risk to omit these things. He thought that if Dean could get the supplicant from here, he probably wouldn't go to other territories to ask. Dean didn't understand the situation here, so he really didn't think that he could get the legendary parasitic soul worm in advance by spending money. For him, this was something taken from the monster's body. It was not something that could be bought easily. But Loxic's words overturned his original concept. In this giant wall, in the mysterious temple, it seemed that the legendary parasitic soul worm was just a commodity that could be bought with money. Do I still need to make an appointment? Dean thought for a moment and asked, Is there no parasitic soul worm stored in the temple? It's impossible. It takes so long to get it? Don't tell me they go out to hunt after you place an order? Loxic's heart skipped a beat. He shook his head and said, I don't know about this. This is the temple's business. We, the lords, have no right to ask. But some lords with connections in the king's city may know some inside information. What he said was half true and half false. Dean couldn't tell. From Dean's performance, Loxic had roughly guessed Dean's identity, which made his heart tremble. If Dean came from outside the giant wall, then his situation was even more dangerous. Once Dean finished using him, he was likely to kill him. Dean looked at him suspiciously. He didn't hide the doubt in his heart. Instead, he fully revealed it on his face. He stared at Loxic with the word, doubt, written on his face. He didn't speak. Although he didn't know whether Loxic lied to him or not, in order to prevent Loxic from lying, he deliberately blackmailed him to see. Loxic looked at Dean's suspicious attitude. His heart skipped a beat. Even though he had been a lord for many years and was shrewd, he still felt a little guilty. This was human nature. Not to mention that Dean was not an ordinary person. He had a bit of a superior temperament, and he had Loxic's life in his hands. He could kill Loxic at any time. Loxic couldn't help but be nervous, but he tried to keep his expression calm. He said with a wry smile, Sir, I'm not deceiving you. What I said is true. If you don't believe me, you can ask other lords. If I'm lying, you can come back to deal with me. He said very sincerely, almost patting his chest to guarantee. Anyone who saw such an attitude would dispel their doubts. But Dean narrowed his eyes and said, Life is hard to come by. It's even harder to be born into a lord's family with a golden spoon. I forgot to tell you that I have an ability to detect lies. You just lied. I don't know which sentence you lied, but I hope you can confess. Otherwise, I can only regret making you silent forever. For me, it's just a few more steps to find another lord. Do you understand? He didn't mean to scare Loxic. He used his X-ray vision to see Lozic's physical condition. In the 2 years after he became the Lord of the Wall, he would occasionally read some old psychological books recorded in the superchip. With his X-ray vision ability, it was almost equivalent to a lie detection ability. Lozic's previous reaction, his heartbeat sped up a few beats, his fingers moved slightly, his pores shrank, and other small reactions fully showed that he was lying. Lozic's throat moved and his heart was cold. He looked at Dean's serious expression and knew that Dean didn't lie to him. If it was someone else, he would have snorted. But Dean was different. Loxic had already guessed Dean's identity and determined that he was an outsider. He didn't know what kind of ability the people outside the wall had. However, he naturally wouldn't reveal it so easily. He could only say, I really didn't lie to you. But there is one thing I didn't say. Those lords who have a relationship with the temple have many masters under their command. Even if you go there, most of them won't be good. What he said was true. He looked up at Dean, wanting to see Dean's reaction. He wanted to see if Dean really had the ability to detect lies. Dean narrowed his eyes. Is that all? Lozic felt uncomfortable as Dean looked at him. He didn't expect that the young man would be so difficult to fool. He braced himself and said, Elder, I've said all that I should say. That's all. He thought that even if Dean knew that he deliberately omitted some things in the future, he could use the excuse that he was nervous and forgot about it. Dean didn't pursue the matter. He was completely unfamiliar with this place. He could only rely on coercion to make Lozic confess. If Lozic really wanted to lie, then he couldn't do anything. Psychological analysis by physical reaction was not 100% accurate. He could only continue to ask, How many supplicants can you buy? Since you can buy them, do you have masters who use supplicants in your territory? Lozic saw that Dean was not satisfied and almost vomited blood. He said with a bitter face, Elder, with the things I have, I'll probably go bankrupt if I can buy one from the temple. The people under me don't have the luck to use such good things. With the resources to buy one supplicant, I can buy 10 other legendary parasitic soul worms. Dean raised his eyebrows and thought that was true. Even if he could buy it, the price would be the most expensive. It seemed that this thing could be bought if one wanted to, but not every noble could afford it. There were 30 or 40 nobles like Lozic, but they couldn't afford it. The high-level people in the temple should be able to afford it. They actually have surplus to sell. Dean narrowed his eyes and thought for a moment. He asked Lozic, Who is the strongest lord in your eyes? How much stronger is he than your territory? Lozic curled his lips in his heart. Still pretending? You could have just asked the most powerful lord here. Thinking about it, Lozic answered honestly, I think the strongest lord should be the Red Rose Lord. Their territory is much larger than mine. They have dozens of masters who can kill 10,000 people. We can't compare with them. 10,000 people? Dean raised his eyebrows and glanced at the young man's body on the ground. Just like that? Lozic nodded and was more sure of Dean's identity. Dean didn't care whether his identity was exposed or not. He didn't care about it. He just didn't expect that the pioneer's identity in the giant wall was called 10,000 people. It seemed that the strength level was not unified in the kingdom of God. If he wanted to know the unified name, he had to go to the kingdom of God. Are there masters who can kill 10,000 people? Dean asked. Lozic knew that Dean might not be asking about the Red Rose territory, but he still answered truthfully. Yes, it is said that the Red Rose territory has 2 demon generals who can easily kill 10,000 people. Speaking of this, he looked at Dean. In his opinion, Dean belonged to this level. Dean heard a different name. He frowned but didn't say anything. He asked some other things, such as the situation in King's City, the situation in the temple, and the Monster Research Institute. However, when he asked about the Monster Research Institute, Lozic said he had never heard of it. Dean felt strange. Then he asked about the origin of the Monster Handbook. He knew that the temple was the Monster Research Institute here. But he didn't expect that its status would change and become the strongest force here. Through talking with Lozic, Dean gradually understood the system here. Above the Lord was the royal family in King's City, and then there was the temple which was on equal footing with the royal family. The lords were loyal to the royal family, but they were in awe of the temple. It seems that the people in charge of the Monster Research Institute have a lot of ambitions. All the masters under the lords are from the temple. It can be said that the lords have to be obedient in front of the temple. If the royal family didn't have the wall lord who could cross the abyss and enter the kingdom of God, then the temple would have soft control over the royal family. Dean secretly thought. The Monster Research Institute here was a bit like the monastery in Sylvia. Black and white were reversed. They were obviously demons, but they had the identity of a god. Moreover, they were more competent than a god. Dean stepped forward and patted Lozic's shoulder twice after the conversation was over. Lozic felt his shoulder was sore. It seemed that something had drilled into his body. He was scared and took 2 steps back. He looked at Dean with fear and anger. What are you doing? Didn't we agree? Dean raised his hand to interrupt him. Don't worry, I won't take your life for the time being. I just put something in your body. As long as you are honest and obedient, I will take it out after half a month. By the way, don't do useless work. Apart from me, no one here can find this thing. I can't even see anything strange in your body. He deliberately said here. He had asked so many questions before. As long as Lozic wasn't stupid, he would be able to guess his identity. Dean's words were tantamount to admitting his identity. At the same time, it would make Lozic more afraid. I almost forgot to tell you that if this thing isn't taken out after 20 days, you will never want to see your end. Oh yes, your wife and children don't want to see that kind of picture. So you better not play any trick. I have rented a room in the town called Frog Hotel. I will wait for you there in 15 days. Dean patted Lozic's shoulder. Lozic shrank back. He was afraid and his face was ugly. He didn't doubt Dean's words. He didn't see clearly when Dean's finger touched his shoulder. But he felt that something had drilled into his shoulder. He only hoped that Dean's words were not true. He hoped that he could find someone to take out the thing. Dean smiled and put his palm in front of Lozic's eyes. When he put down his palm, Lozic only saw the monster illustrated handbook in front of his eyes. But Dean had disappeared without a trace. Only the booklet fell to the ground. The cold sound made Lozic's heart turn cold. Dean took advantage of the night to return to the town. He patted Locke's shoulder but didn't implant anything into his body. He just tapped on Locke's acupuncture points. He had read the knowledge of acupuncture points left by his ancestors in the superchip. It was the essence of ancient medical technique. Because of this, he could only fool Locke by saying that the people here couldn't find anything wrong with his acupuncture point. If he said that, then Locke wouldn't be able to find anything wrong with his acupuncture point. Most of the time, he wouldn't be able to find anything wrong with it. Most of the time, he wouldn't dare to ignore it. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.